Listen closely. This is not a fairy tale. This is a story about debt, about blood, about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself with trumpets, but arrives quietly on trembling legs in the middle of a Colorado blizzard. It is the story of a woman who was sold before she ever knew she had a price, and the three brothers who burned their peaceful lives to the ground to keep her alive. It began as most tragedies do, with a piece of paper. Boston, Massachusetts, late autumn 1881. The city was wrapped in a gray, suffocating fog that smelled of coal smoke and rotting fish from the harbor. In a narrow boarding house above Hargrove's textile mill on the east side of the waterfront district, a young woman sat on the edge of a sagging iron bed, staring at an eviction notice pinned to her door with a rusted nail. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 20 years old. She had 11 cents in a tin box beneath the floorboard, a pair of hands rubbed raw from 14 hours a day at the power looms, and absolutely nothing else in the world. 6 months earlier, her mother, Margaret Whitfield, had died of consumption in this very room. Clara had held her hand through the final night, listening to the wet, rattling breaths grow further and further apart until they stopped altogether, leaving behind a silence so vast it seemed to swallow the walls. Margaret was buried in a pauper's grave on the outskirts of the city, marked by a wooden stake that would rot away within a year. Clara could not afford a stone. But Clara Whitfield was not an ordinary factory girl, and this is important to understand because everything that follows depends upon it. Her mother, Margaret, had been the daughter of Professor Aldous Harwick of the University of Pennsylvania, a scholar of classical languages who lost his position in a scandal involving university funds that were never adequately explained. The disgrace destroyed the family. Margaret, cast out of society with nothing but her education, and her pride, had raised Clara alone in a series of increasingly desperate boarding houses, moving from Philadelphia to New York to Boston, always one step ahead of the landlord. And she had taught Clara everything: Latin, literature, watercolors, history, Shakespeare and Milton, and the basic principles of anatomy from a medical textbook she had stolen from a secondhand bookshop because she could not afford the 6 cents they were asking. Clara could parse a sentence in 3 languages, identify a Caravaggio from across a gallery, and recite the major bones of the human skeleton from memory. None of which, as she sat staring at the eviction notice, put a single crumb of bread on the table. What kept Clara alive was something less tangible than knowledge. It was a quality she had inherited from her mother, a quiet, unyielding refusal to beg. Margaret Whitfield had never once asked for charity, not when they were eating boiled potato skins for the 3rd consecutive week, not when the winter cold crept through the walls and turned their breath to frost on the blankets. She had worked, she had endured, and she had died with her dignity intact, which was, Clara sometimes thought bitterly, the only inheritance she had left behind. That and a gold locket, a small oval thing on a thin chain containing no photograph, no lock of hair. Just an empty locket that Margaret had worn every day of Clara's life and had pressed into her daughter's palm in the final hour. "Keep it," Margaret had whispered, her voice no louder than paper tearing. "It was all he ever gave me." She never said who he was. And Clara, who had been told her entire life that her father had died in a mining accident before she was born, had never thought to ask. On this particular November evening, the landlady, Mrs. Doyle, a woman built like a rain barrel with a disposition to match, shoved a crumpled newspaper through the gap beneath Clara's door, along with a handwritten note that read, "Pay by Friday or sleep in the gutter. I am done with charity cases." Clara picked up the newspaper. It was 3 days old, the ink already smudging the pages damp from the fog. She smoothed it across her knees, not because she intended to read it, but because the simple act of smoothing paper was a small gesture of order in a life that had lost all order entirely. Her eyes drifted to the classified advertisements: positions wanted, rooms to let, patent medicines guaranteed to cure everything from gout to melancholy. And then, wedged between an advertisement for a horse auction in Vermont and a plea for investors in a California citrus farm, a small block of text that would alter the trajectory of Clara Whitfield's life as violently and completely as a derailed locomotive. Wanted a respectable, educated young woman of good moral character to serve as wife and homemaker on a prosperous mountain ranch in the Colorado Territory. Must be willing to endure frontier hardship. Generous provisions guaranteed. Respond to T. Crawford, care of Ridgewood Post Office, Colorado. Clara read it twice. Then a third time. She was not a romantic. She harbored no illusions about what a mail-order bride advertisement truly meant. It meant a transaction. It meant a man in some godforsaken corner of the wilderness needed a woman to cook his meals, mend his clothes, and keep his house, and was willing to provide food and shelter in exchange. It was stripped of all pretense of business arrangement. One form of survival traded for another. But here's the thing about survival that comfortable people never understand. When you are 20 years old, orphaned, penniless, and staring at an eviction notice in a city that will chew you up and spit your bones into the harbor without a moment's hesitation, you do not have the luxury of waiting for a better option. You take the option that exists, you take it with both hands, and you hold on. Clara wrote the letter that same night, sitting on the floor beside the single tallow candle. She could not afford to replace her pen dipped in ink she had diluted with water to make it last longer. She wrote plainly without embellishment. She stated her name, her age, her education, and her willingness to work. She did not mention her poverty. She did not mention her mother's death. She did not beg. Margaret Whitfield's daughter did not beg. She mailed it the next morning, spending 3 of her 11 remaining cents on postage, and then she waited. 3 weeks. 21 days of 14-hour shifts at the looms of watered soup and stale bread, of Mrs. Doyle's increasingly venomous reminders that Friday was approaching. Clara did not allow herself to hope. Hope was a luxury like fresh eggs or a warm coat, and she could not afford luxuries. On the 22nd day, a reply arrived. It was written on rough, heavy paper, the kind made from wood pulp rather than cotton, in a hand that was blunt and forceful. Each letter pressed deep into the page as though the writer had been gripping the pen like a weapon. There was no greeting, no pleasantry, no description of the ranch, the town, or the man himself. Miss Whitfield, terms accepted. Enclosed is a rail ticket to Ridgewood, Colorado. Arrive before the first week of December or the pass will close for winter. T. Crawford. That was all. A one-way train ticket and a command. Now here is the part of the story that Clara did not know, the part that changes everything. Because this advertisement, this precisely worded, carefully placed notice in a Boston newspaper, was not the work of a lonely rancher looking for companionship. It was a calculated extraction. The man who placed it, a scarred and terrifying mounted man named Theron Crawford, knew exactly who Clara Whitfield was. He knew her name. He knew her mother's name. He knew the address of the boarding house above Hargrove's Mill, and he knew with a certainty that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights that if he did not get Clara out of Boston before Christmas, she would vanish into an underground network of human trafficking that stretched from Denver to San Francisco, and no one would ever see her again. Why the advertisement rather than a direct letter? Because the Kessler Syndicate had eyes in Boston. Theron had learned through intercepted telegraphs that they were already monitoring Clara's mail, waiting for the moment Edmund gave the order to collect her. A personal letter from an unknown man in Colorado would have been flagged intercepted red, but a mail-order bride advertisement buried among dozens of others in a 3-day-old newspaper was invisible. It was one grain of sand on a beach. The syndicate's men would never notice it, and even if they did, they would never connect it to their target. Theron Crawford had survived 15 years on a mountain by understanding that the best way to move unseen was not to hide, but to be so ordinary that no one bothered to look. Clara packed her single carpet bag. One spare dress, a wool shawl, her mother's gold locket, the stolen medical textbook, a small watercolor set with 3 remaining cakes of pigment. She did not say goodbye to Mrs. Doyle. She did not say goodbye to anyone because there was no one to say goodbye to. She walked to the South Street rail station in the gray December dawn, boarded the westbound train, and watched Boston disappear behind her without a single tear. She had cried herself empty months ago. There was nothing left. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of rattling coaches, of switching trains in Chicago, and then again in Kansas City, of sleeping upright on hard wooden benches, while the landscape outside the windows transformed from the gray, cramped cities of the East into the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Great Plains. Clara had never seen so much sky. It stretched from horizon to horizon like an inverted ocean, so immense and so indifferent that it made her feel less like a person and more like a speck of dust being carried by a wind she could not control. On the morning of the 12th day, the train pulled into Ridgewood, Colorado territory. Ridgewood was a silver mining boomtown, wedged into a narrow valley at the foot of a mountain range, so jagged and forbidding that it looked like the broken jaw of some enormous buried animal. The locals called the highest peak Iron Peak Ridge, and they spoke of it the way sailors speak of a reef that has claimed too many ships. The town itself was a single main street of mud mule teams, saloons, and desperate men. Frame buildings leaned against each other like drunks. The sound of hammers rang from a half-built church at the far end of the street. The smell of horse manure, wood smoke, and something metallic, the smell of the mines, hung over everything. At the very top of the town's social hierarchy, though, Clara did not know this and would not learn it for weeks, sat a man named Mayor Edmund Whitfield. He had held power in Ridgewood for 12 years. He lived in a three-story Victorian mansion that stood in ludicrous contrast to the muddy chaos of the valley below. He was 56 years old, silver-haired, possessed of a politician's booming laugh and a gambler's hollow soul. And he was Clara's father. But Clara believed her father was dead. Her mother had told her so. And the dead, as a general rule, do not hold public office. Clara stepped off the train into a December wind that hit her like a closed fist. It cut straight through her thin wool coat, through the worn cotton of her dress, through her skin, and settled directly into her bones. She clutched her carpet bag against her chest and scanned the platform, looking for anyone who might be T. Crawford. The platform was nearly empty. A drunk miner in a battered hat staggered past, leering at her with bloodshot eyes. A woman in a garish red saloon dress leaned against the post, smoking a thin cigarillo, watching Clara with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and amusement. A dog ribbed with hunger nosed through a pile of garbage near the tracks. No one approached her. No one called her name. And then the crowd shifted. People simply moved. They shifted their weight, angled their shoulders, created space the way water parts around a stone instinctively without thinking, because some deep animal part of their brain told them to get out of the way. Three men emerged from the far end of the platform, and every head on that station turned to watch them. They were enormous. That was the first thing Clara registered, before the details, before the faces, before the fear. They were simply overwhelmingly large. All three stood well over 6 feet with broad shoulders that seemed to block out the gray sky behind them. They wore heavy dusters over dark clothing, wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the wind, and weathered leather boots that had seen more miles than most horses. They moved together with the wordless, predatory coordination of men who had survived by relying on each other and absolutely no one else. The townsfolk gave them a wide berth and whispered as they passed. The man in the center was the tallest and by far the most frightening. He had chestnut brown hair that brushed his collar, a thick jaw shadowed by several days of dark stubble, and a scar that stopped Clara's breath in her throat. It was a jagged silver line that slashed from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from dragging two trapped miners out of a collapsed shaft in 1878 when the local authorities had refused to dig. His eyes were the color of whiskey held to firelight, and they were locked onto Clara with an intensity that made her want to step backward off the platform and onto the tracks. This was Theron Crawford, the eldest, 33 years old. The people of Ridgewood called him the Ghost of Iron Peak because he descended from the mountain only 2 or 3 times a year to trade pelts for salt, gunpowder, and coffee, and because he moved through the world with the terrifying silence of a man who had learned very young that noise attracted things that could kill you. To his left stood a man with dark blonde hair cut shorter than his brother's arms crossed over a chest that strained the seams of his duster jaw clenched with barely restrained hostility. His posture radiated suspicion the way a stove radiates heat. He did not look at Clara with curiosity. He looked at her with open, undisguised challenge, as if daring her to justify the considerable trouble her existence was about to cause. This was Boone Crawford, 30 years old, the middle brother. A man who had served briefly and disastrously as a military scout on the Great Plains at the age of 18, and who had returned from that experience with a set of skills perfectly suited for violence, and a set of scars, most of them invisible, that had never properly healed. To the right of the eldest stood a man with auburn hair, slightly longer and wavier than his brother's, and the gentlest expression of the three, though gentle, for a Crawford still registered as roughly hewn granite to anyone accustomed to civilized company. He carried something that Clara, even through her fear, recognized as warmth, a flicker, faint but present, He was the one who carried a leather medical satchel slung over one shoulder. This was Everett Crawford, 27, the youngest, the reader, the healer, the one who had taught himself frontier medicine from stolen textbooks and sheer desperation, and who would, before this story ended, hold his brother's life in his hands. Theron stepped forward. The crowd noise dropped to nothing. His voice when it came was deep and rough, the voice of a man who did not waste words because he had spent years in a place where there was no one to waste them on. Clara Whitfield. She nodded. Her throat had gone completely dry. I'm Theron Crawford. These are my brothers. That was all. No welcome. No reassurance. He reached out one massive, calloused hand and took her carpet bag from her grip as easily as if it weighed nothing. Wagons out back. Storm's coming. We need to move. Boone, the middle brother, muttered something under his breath. Clara caught only two words, and they were not encouraging. A mistake. Everett, the youngest, shot his brother a sharp look and then turned to Clara. He was the one who removed his hat. He was the one who extended a hand. Ma'am, welcome to Colorado. A pause. Don't mind Boone. His manners froze off somewhere around 73. We've been hoping they'd grow back, but the prognosis is not good. Clara almost smiled, almost. But as she turned to follow them toward the back of the station, something caught the edge of her vision that drove the almost smile from her face and replaced it with a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind. On the platform behind them, standing perfectly still while the rest of the crowd milled and shuffled, was a man in a dark suit and bowler hat. He was lean, clean-shaven, and utterly unremarkable, the kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance, which was precisely what made him dangerous. He was watching Clara with the focused, unblinking attention of a predator assessing prey. As she looked at him, he pulled a small leather notebook from his breast pocket, wrote something in it with a stub of pencil, and then turned and disappeared into the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to not being seen. Clara did not know him. She did not know his name. She did not know that he worked for an organization called the Kessler Syndicate, a criminal network based in Denver, that operated in the shadows between legitimate business and outright savagery. She did not know that he had been waiting at the station for 3 days, watching every train, checking every passenger, looking specifically for a young woman matching her exact description. But the Crawford brothers did. The journey up Iron Peak Ridge was a 4-hour descent into a world Clara had never imagined and was in no way prepared for. The heavy flatbed wagon pulled by two massive draft horses with shaggy winter coats and hooves the size of dinner plates climbed a narrow trail that switched back through dense pine forest so thick the trees seemed to press against the wagon on both sides. The temperature, already brutal at the station, dropped with every 100 feet of elevation. Rain became sleet. Sleet became snow. Snow became a driving, blinding white wall that reduced visibility to the length of the wagon and turned the forest into a howling, colorless void. Clara sat on the wooden bench between Theron, who drove, and Everett, who sat beside her with his medical satchel between his boots. Boone rode horseback alongside the wagon, a dark shape barely visible through the whiteout, refusing to share the bench. His message was clear. I am here because I was ordered to be. Do not mistake proximity for welcome. For 4 hours, almost no one spoke. Clara shivered so violently that her teeth chattered in a continuous, humiliating rhythm, and her jaw ached from the effort of keeping her mouth closed. She was terrified. Not of violence exactly, not yet, but of the sheer vertiginous unknown. She had signed a mail-order bride contract that functioned as a legal proxy marriage. She was climbing into genuine wilderness with 3 men she had met 12 minutes ago, and if they chose to do anything to her, not a single soul in the world would know or care. The wagon hit a deep, frozen rut. Clara, unprepared, to slam sideways into the wooden side rail with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. She let out a sharp, involuntary cry of pain. Theron pulled back on the reins. The horses stopped. The wind screamed. Theron turned his massive frame toward her, and for one terrible, suspended second, Clara braced herself. She did not know what she was bracing for: a reprimand, a blow, some demonstration of the authority she had signed away. Instead, without a word, without even looking at her face, Theron reached behind the bench and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe, the kind made from an entire bull's hide, with the thick winter fur still attached. He threw it roughly over her lap and shoulders. Then he turned back to the horses, snapped the reins, and drove on. The robe was extraordinarily warm. It smelled of wood smoke, pine sap, and something else, something masculine and unfamiliar that Clara could not name. She huddled inside it, her shivering, slowly subsiding, and stared at the broad, unyielding back of the man who had just covered her without being asked and without expecting thanks. Beside her, Everett spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. He brought that robe down from the cabin this morning, had it warming by the fire since before dawn. A pause, Bo. Just so you know. Clara looked at Everett, then she looked at the back of Theron's head. Something shifted in her chest, some recalibration of the fear she had been carrying since the train station. Not a reduction of the fear, not yet, but a complication of it. A question mark where before there had been only an exclamation point. Then Boone rode up alongside the wagon. He leaned from his saddle toward Theron and spoke in a low, tense voice that the wind nearly swallowed. Clara caught only fragments, but the fragments were enough. Kessler men, at the station. At least one, they know she's here. Theron's jaw tightened until the scar on his cheek turned white. He said nothing. He did not turn around. He snapped the reins harder, and the draft horses surged forward through the deepening snow. Clara's blood, which had just begun to warm beneath the buffalo robe, turned to ice water. She did not know who the Kessler men were. She did not understand why strangers at a train station would be watching her arrival. But the Crawford brothers clearly expected this. They were not surprised. They were not panicked. They were prepared. And that more than anything told Clara that she had stepped into something far larger, far more dangerous, and far more deliberate than a simple mail-order marriage. She had not been invited to the mountain. She had been extracted from something. She just did not know what. The cabin on Iron Peak Ridge was not what Clara expected. She had spent the last 4 hours constructing an image in her frozen, terrified mind, a squalid shack, dirt floors, animal skins nailed to the walls, the kind of place where men like the Crawford brothers would drag a purchased wife to live out her days in misery. What she found was something else entirely. The Crawford homestead was a compound. The main cabin was large, built from massive hand-hewn pine logs fitted together with a precision that spoke of years of labor and considerable skill. The gaps between the logs were chinked flawlessly with a mixture of mud and dried moss that sealed out the wind completely. The structure sat backed against a sheer granite rock wall, a natural fortification that protected it from the savage northern gales. A heavy stone chimney built from river rock and mortar dominated the eastern wall. A separate, smaller cabin served as a workshop and smokehouse. A sturdy log barn large enough for several horses and livestock sat 30 yards to the south. The entire property was positioned with an eye for defense that Clara, who had read enough military history to recognize it, found deeply unsettling. There was only one approach trail, rock walls on 3 sides, and clear sight lines down the mountain slope for a quarter mile. This was not a homestead, it was a fortress. Theron brought the draft horses to a halt. Before he could step down, the heavy timber door of the main cabin swung open and something erupted from the interior that made Clara press herself backward against the bench with a gasp. It was a dog. But calling it a dog was like calling the Pacific Ocean a pond. The animal was enormous, a hybrid of wolf and mastiff that stood nearly waist-high with a coat of coarse gray fur and jaws that looked capable of crushing a man's thigh bone. It bounded through the snow with a speed that belied its size and launched itself at Theron, planting 2 massive paws on his chest. Theron did not flinch. He reached up and scratched the beast roughly behind the ears. "Down, Atlas." His voice for the first time was softer, not gentle exactly, but less severe. The dog dropped to all fours, tail whipping back and forth with frantic enthusiasm. Theron walked to Clara's side of the wagon. This time he did not wait for her to struggle down on her own. He reached up his hand, spanning her waist completely, and lifted her off the bench as effortlessly as if she were made of straw. He set her down in the snow, his grip lingering for a fraction of a second before he pulled away. "Go inside, don't wander. You won't make it 100 yards in this dark, and the wolves will find you before you freeze." Clara gathered the buffalo robe around her shoulders, gave Atlas a wide berth, and hurried toward the open cabin door. She stepped over the heavy timber threshold and stopped. The interior was immaculately clean. The floors were rough-sawn timber, yes, but they had been swept to within an inch of their existence. The massive stone hearth held the glowing remains of a fire that had been banked before the brothers left that morning, still radiating warmth into the single large room. To her left, a small kitchen area held a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with neatly organized tin cans, glass jars of preserved fruit and vegetables, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters in tidy rows. A heavy oak table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room. 4 chairs. Clara noted this. They had expected her. To her right, a thick wool curtain partitioned off a sleeping area containing a large bed frame made from stripped birch branches piled high with furs and quilts. Beyond the curtain, a sturdy wooden ladder led up to a loft space beneath the pitched roof. The cabin smelled of cedar-dried apples and wood smoke. There was no dust, no grime, no smell of rot or neglect. It was, Clara realized with a disorientation so profound it bordered on vertigo, a home. A rough one, a frontier one, but a home that someone had taken great care to build and maintain with something that looked remarkably like pride. Theron entered behind her, carrying her carpet bag and a crate of supplies. He kicked the heavy door shut and threw the iron latch. He set her bag near the curtained sleeping area and pointed at the bed. "That's yours." Clara blinked. "What?" "The bed. It's yours. We sleep in the loft." Boone, stomping snow off his boots by the door, let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Don't flatter yourself, Boston. We've been sleeping up there since we built this place. You're the guest, not the queen." Everett intervened with practiced smoothness. "What Boone means in his characteristically graceful way is that you will have privacy. We respect that." He lifted a tin pot from the cast-iron stove, where it had been simmering over low coals, and poured a steaming liquid into a tin mug. He handed it to Clara. "Willow bark and chicory. It will stop the shaking." Clara wrapped her frozen hands around the mug. The heat seared her blistered palms, and she welcomed the pain because it meant she could still feel. She took a sip. It was bitter and scalding, and it sent a rush of warmth down her throat that felt in that moment like being pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Theron, without ceremony, moved to the stove and began to cook. He worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm that contradicted everything about his appearance, slicing cured meat, dropping it into a cast-iron skillet. The sizzle filled the cabin. Within 20 minutes, he set a plate in front of Clara, fried salt pork beans seasoned with pepper and wild onion and thick slices of dense sourdough bread. He served the same to his brothers, took his own plate, and sat at the opposite end of the table. They ate in silence. Clara, despite her terror, discovered that she was ravenously hungry, and the food was, to her astonishment, genuinely good. Flavorful and hearty, and cooked by someone who knew what they were doing. She ate every bite and fought the urge to lick the plate. When the meal was done, Theron washed his plate in a tin basin, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf with the same precise, careful movements he applied to everything. Then, without a word, the 3 brothers climbed the ladder to the loft. Boone went first, not looking back. Everett paused on the second rung and looked down at Clara. "Good night, Miss Whitfield. The fire will keep for a few hours, but if it dies, there's kindling in the box and matches on the mantel. Don't let it go out. At this elevation, the cold will kill you faster than anything else on this mountain." Then he was gone up into the loft, and Clara was alone. She stood in the center of the cabin for a full 5 minutes, motionless, listening. She listened for the creak of the ladder, for heavy footsteps, for the sound of someone descending in the dark and with intentions that the daylight would not permit. She heard nothing. Nothing except the pop and hiss of the fire, the occasional low whimper of Atlas, who had curled up on a rug near the hearth, with his enormous head resting on his paws, and the relentless screaming fury of the blizzard against the log walls. 3 men who looked like they could tear a grizzly apart with their bare hands had given her the only private bed in the cabin, cooked her a hot meal, and retreated to the loft without a single inappropriate word, gesture, or glance. It did not match the horror story she had constructed in her mind. It did not match the mail-order bride narratives she had read in Penny Dreadfuls. It did not match anything. But Boone's hostility was real. The Kessler men at the station were real, and the question that burned in Clara's mind as she crawled, still fully clothed beneath the mountain of furs on the bed that smelled of cedar and pine, was the same question that should be burning in yours. Why? Why did 3 mountain men living in a fortress on a frozen ridge send for a mail-order bride they clearly did not need for companionship? What were they truly protecting her from? And how did they know to protect her at all? She lay awake for hours listening to the blizzard, clutching her mother's empty gold locket and staring at the log ceiling above her. Then, just as exhaustion was finally pulling her under, she heard something from the loft. A voice, low, barely audible over the wind. She could not make out the words, but she caught a name. Edmund. Clara's eyes flew open. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Edmund, her father's name, her dead father. The man who, according to her mother, had perished in a mining accident before Clara drew her first breath. A ghost. A name on no gravestone because there was no gravestone, no grave, no proof of anything except her mother's word. But Theron Crawford had just spoken that name in the darkness as if the man attached to it were very much alive. Clara lay motionless in the furs, barely breathing, her mind racing so fast she could feel her pulse in her temples. Something was very wrong with the story she had been told about her life. Something was very wrong with everything. And the man sleeping 20 feet above her head, the scarred, silent ghost of Iron Peak, knew what it was. The first 3 weeks on the mountain were a masterclass in survival and a slow, agonizing education in silence. Clara woke that first morning to find the fire already roaring, a pot of coffee boiling on the stove, and the cabin empty except for Atlas, who watched her with intelligent, unblinking yellow eyes from his position by the hearth. The brothers operated on a schedule dictated by the mountain. Theron left before dawn to check the trap lines that provided their primary income in furs and pelts. Boone scouted the perimeter of the property every morning, a military habit that underscored the siege mentality of their existence. Everett tended the livestock in the barn and maintained the smokehouse. Clara's instructions, delivered by Theron in terse, practical sentences that wasted not a single syllable, were simple. Keep the fire burning. Keep the snow cleared from the chimney vent. Don't let the sourdough starter freeze. If you hear scratching at the door after dark, do not open it. It is not a stray dog. It is a cougar. She was utterly out of her depth. Her hands soft from a lifetime of poverty, but never this kind of labor, blistered from chopping kindling. She burned her forearms on the cast iron stove. She ruined a batch of venison stew by adding twice the amount of salt it required, and then stood frozen at the stove waiting for the explosion. For the rage. For the punishment that always followed failure in every story she had ever heard about men who bought women. Theron came in from the cold, sat down at the table, and ate the entire bowl of oversalted stew without a word. He drank 2 full canteens of water afterward, his expression completely unreadable. The next morning before he left for the traps, he set 2 tin measuring cups on the kitchen shelf and showed her without condescension and without explanation how to measure salt, pepper, and dried herbs. Then he put on his hat and walked out the door. That was it. No anger, no cruelty, no lecture, just a correction so quiet it barely qualified as communication. Boone, on the other hand, was openly hostile. He questioned Clara's presence at every meal, always addressing his complaints to Theron as though Clara were a piece of furniture rather than a person. She can't shoot. She can't ride. She can't track. She burned the bread again. She left the barn door unlatched, and the mare nearly bolted. She is a liability, Theron, and when the snow melts and they come up this trail, a liability is a death sentence. He was not wrong about her deficiencies. He was, however, deeply wrong about Clara Whitfield's capacity to be broken. She met his hostility with a steady, quiet stubbornness that had been forged in Boston boarding houses and tempered by 14-hour shifts at a power loom. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not cower. She simply looked at him, absorbed whatever he had said, and went back to whatever task she had been doing a little more carefully than before. It infuriated Boone, which Clara suspected was precisely why she kept doing it. One night, deep into the second week, Clara could not sleep. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and padded to the hearth on bare feet, intending to add a log to the dying fire. She found Boone already there, sitting in the chair beside the embers, staring into the coals with an expression she had never seen on his face. It was not anger. It was not suspicion. It was grief. Old grief, the kind that has calcified into something permanent. He looked up when he heard her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Boone turned his gaze back to the fire and said in a voice so different from his usual snarl that it might have come from a different man entirely. Year of '69, I was 18, rode with a scout company out on the Great Plains. Government sent us to escort settlers through the territory. He paused. The fire popped. We came to a homestead that had been attacked. We were 4 hours late. Everyone was dead. Another pause longer this time. There was a young woman, blonde hair, about your age. Clara did not move. She barely breathed. Since that day, Boone continued, his jaw working. I swore I would never be late again, but I also swore I would never let anyone inside the circle if they were going to become a target. He looked at Clara. It was the first time he had looked at her directly, not through her, not past her, but at her. You understand why I don't want you here. It's not because I hate you. It's because I'm afraid I can't keep you alive. Clara sat down in the chair across from him. The fire crackled between them. Then teach me to keep myself alive, she said. Boone stared at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the fire and said nothing more. But when Clara finally climbed back into bed, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The wall was still there, but a crack had appeared. It was Everett who became her bridge to understanding the brothers. During the quiet hours of the afternoon, while Theron checked traps and Boone scouted, Everett would sit at the oak table with his medical texts spread before him, and he would talk. Not freely, not carelessly, but in fragments, like a man handing over pieces of a map one at a time. He told her they had been orphaned young. Their mother had died of winter fever in the Appalachian foothills when Everett was only 4. Their father, Thomas Crawford, had brought them west to Colorado, discovered a rich silver vein on Iron Peak Ridge, and begun building the life he had always dreamed of. Then he had been killed. A claim dispute, the official report said. But there had been nothing official about it. Theron was 18, Everett said quietly. I was 12. Boone was 15. Theron put us on a mule, took us higher into the mountains than anyone had ever settled before, and built this cabin with his bare hands over the course of a single summer. He fed us. He taught us to hunt. He kept us alive. A pause. He has been keeping people alive ever since. It is the only thing he knows how to do. Clara listened, and when the moment felt right, she asked the question that had been clawing at her chest since her first night in the cabin. Why did Theron send for me? Everett's face tightened. He closed his medical text. That is Theron's to tell, Moss, he said carefully, when he is ready. Then on a gray afternoon in late December, Clara found the photograph. She was sweeping the cabin floor, a task she had taken over because it was one of the few domestic duties she could perform without setting something on fire. Her broom caught the edge of something wedged between 2 logs near the base of the hearth behind the woodpile. She knelt down and worked it free with her fingers. It was a tintype photograph, small, faded. The image was of a young woman captured in the formal, unsmiling style of the era, sitting in a straight-back chair with her hands folded in her lap. The woman had golden hair. She had cornflower blue eyes. She had a delicate heart-shaped face and an expression that conveyed, even through the stiffness of the pose, intelligence and quiet determination. Clara's breath stopped. The woman in the photograph looked almost exactly like her. With trembling hands, Clara turned the tintype over. On the back, in faded brown ink, 2 words, Margaret. Margaret, 1859. Margaret, her mother's name. Photographed in 1859 when she would have been almost exactly Clara's current age. Clara's hands were shaking so badly the tintype rattled against her fingertips. Why did the Crawford brothers have a photograph of her mother? Her mother, who had lived in Boston, who had never mentioned Colorado, who had told Clara that her father was a dead miner and nothing more. Why was this image here, hidden in a cabin on a frozen mountain, held by men Clara had never met before this month? That night, Clara did not wait for Theron to speak first. She sat at the oak table with the tintype in front of her, and she waited for the brothers to come down from the loft for Mauer's supper. When all 3 were seated, she placed the photograph in the center of the table. Explain this. Her voice did not tremble. Her hands did not shake. Something inside Clara had shifted, some final gear clicking into place, and the woman sitting at that table was not the same woman who had stepped off the train in Ridgewood 3 weeks ago. Boone saw the photograph and went still. Everett closed his eyes. Theron picked up the tintype and looked at it for a very long time. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Atlas raised his head from his paws and whined softly. Why do you have a picture of my mother? Clara said. Her voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness was something molten. My mother, who told me my father was dead. My mother who never once mentioned Colorado or Ridgewood or the name Crawford. What are you not telling me? Theron set the tintype down on the table. He looked at Clara, and for the first time since she had met him, something behind his eyes gave way. Just for a second. Just enough for her to see what was there. Not cruelty, not calculation. Weariness. Bone-deep, years-long, soul-crushing weariness. Your father is not dead, Clara. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. He is the mayor of Ridgewood. His name is Edmund Whitfield, and he is the reason I brought you to this mountain. Clara stared at him. The cabin walls seemed to tilt. The fire seemed to dim. Every certainty she had ever possessed about her own life, her own history, her own identity, cracked down the center like ice on a spring river. Her father was alive. He had always been alive. And the man sitting across the table, the scarred, terrifying ghost of Iron Peak Ridge, had known this from the beginning. The room spun. Clara gripped the edge of the table with both hands to keep from falling. And in the howling silence of that moment, she understood with a clarity as sharp and cold as the mountain air outside that nothing she had been told about her life was true, and that the truth, whatever it was, lived in the eyes of the man across the table, waiting to be spoken. The dawn came gray and merciless, the way it always came on Iron Peak Ridge, not with the gentle golden light of the valleys below, but with a flat, colorless illumination that stripped the world of softness and revealed everything exactly as it was. The blizzard had died sometime in the small hours, leaving behind a stillness so complete that Clara could hear the individual pops of the fire in the hearth and the slow, rhythmic drip of snowmelt from the eaves. She had not slept. She had lain awake beneath the pile of furs with her mother's gold locket pressed against her breastbone, and her mind turning over a single sentence like a stone in a river, wearing it smooth, wearing it sharp. Your father is not dead. He is the mayor of Ridgewood. Her father, alive. Not a ghost, not a name attached to a mining accident that may never have happened. A living, breathing man who held political office in the very town Clara had stepped into 3 weeks ago, who walked the same muddy streets, who breathed the same mountain air, and who had for 20 years existed less than 10 miles from the cabin where Clara now lay awake in the dark, knowing absolutely nothing about her. Or perhaps knowing everything. She heard the brothers moving in the loft above her, the creak of the ladder, heavy boots on the timber floor, the clank of the coffee pot being set on the stove, the low murmur of voices too quiet to decipher. Then Everett's face appeared at the edge of the wool curtain. He's ready, Everett said softly, if you are. Clara rose. She did not bother to smooth her hair or straighten her rumpled clothing. Vanity was a currency that had lost all value overnight. She walked to the oak table and sat down. Theron was already seated at the opposite end, his massive frame hunched forward, his elbows on the wood, his scarred hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee he had not yet tasted. Boone stood at the window arm, crossed eyes, scanning the tree line, with the automatic vigilance of a man who never truly stopped watching for threats. Everett stoked the fire and then took the chair to Clara's right. Atlas lay at Theron's feet, his enormous head resting on his paws, tracking the tension in the room the way a compass tracks north. Tell me everything, Clara said. Her voice was steady, flat, the voice of a woman who had decided somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn that she would rather be destroyed by the truth than preserved by another lie. Theron looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table, crossed the room, and knelt beside the bed. He pried up a loose floorboard with the blade of his hunting knife and withdrew a waterproof oilskin package roughly the size of a Bible. He set it on the table between them and unwrapped it with the care of a man handling dynamite, which in a sense he was. Inside were documents, a thick stack of them, promissory notes on heavy bond paper, telegraph transcripts, some in plain English and some in a numerical code that Clara could not read, geological survey maps with hand-drawn annotations, ledger pages filled with columns of figures, and at the very bottom a letter bearing the official seal of the Tabor Investment Bank in Denver, Colorado. Theron began to speak. He spoke slowly, not because he was uncertain of the facts, but because the facts were heavy, and he was carrying them one at a time like a man laying stones for a foundation that would have to bear an enormous weight. Your mother told you your father died in a mining accident. Yes, she lied. The word landed like a slap, but Clara did not flinch. She had spent the entire night preparing for this. Edmund Whitfield is alive. He has been the mayor of Ridgewood for 12 years. Before that, he was a mining speculator who came to the Colorado Territory in '61, the same year you were born. He did not come alone. He came with your mother. Clara's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt beneath the table. My mother lived in Ridgewood. Briefly, she and Edmund were not married. He courted her in Philadelphia, where her father, the professor, had just lost his position. She was vulnerable. He was charming. He brought her west with promises. Theron's jaw tightened. When she discovered she was carrying you, Edmund abandoned her. He had met the daughter of a territorial judge, a woman with political connections and family money, and Margaret was an inconvenience. He gave her nothing, not a dollar, not a word. He simply vanished from her life and reinvented himself as a respectable man. Clara absorbed this. The room was very still. Your mother left Ridgewood before you were born. She went back east, Boston. She told you your father was dead because the alternative, that he was alive and had simply chosen not to want you, was a truth she could not bear to speak. Clara thought of her mother, of Margaret Whitfield's quiet dignity, her refusal to beg, her fierce and total devotion to Clara's education and survival, of the gold locket she had pressed into Clara's hand on her deathbed. It was all he ever gave me, not a keepsake of love, a relic of betrayal. How do you know all of this? Clara asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper now, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding herself together. Because Edmund Whitfield didn't just abandon your mother, Theron said. He destroyed my family. And then in the flat gray light of a Colorado morning, with the fire crackling and the snow pressing against the windows and Atlas occasionally sighing at his master's feet, Theron Crawford told Clara the rest of the truth. The Crawford family had come to Colorado in the late '50s. Thomas Crawford, the brother's father, was a prospector from the Appalachian foothills, a widower raising 3 boys on his own after their mother died of winter fever. Thomas was not an educated man, but he was honest, hardworking, and possessed of an almost supernatural instinct for reading rock formations. He discovered the silver vein on Iron Peak Ridge in 1860, a year before Edmund Whitfield arrived in Ridgewood. It was Thomas Crawford's silver that built the town. Thomas Crawford's claim that attracted the speculators, the merchants, the miners, and eventually the politicians, including Edmund Whitfield. Thomas Crawford was a good man but a poor negotiator. Edmund Whitfield was neither. He befriended Thomas, earned his trust, offered to handle the legal filings for the mining claim since Thomas could barely read the documents. And then, with the quiet efficiency of a snake swallowing an egg, Edmund had the paperwork redrawn. The claim was transferred into Edmund's name. Thomas Crawford's signature, the one Thomas had placed on what he believed was a partnership agreement, appeared at the bottom of a document that legally signed away everything he owned. By the time Thomas realized what had happened, it was too late. He protested. He went to the territorial authorities. They were already in Edmund's pocket. He went to the sheriff. The sheriff worked for Edmund. He went to the only lawyer in Ridgewood, who informed Thomas with a sympathetic shake of the head that the documents were airtight and there was nothing to be done. 6 months later, Thomas Crawford was dead. A claim dispute, the official report said. Thomas had confronted Edmund's men at the mine entrance. There was an altercation. Thomas fell, hit his head on a rock. An accident. It was not an accident. I was 18 years old, Theron said. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume. It was still the same low grinding rumble. But something in his eyes had shifted, something that made them go dark, and Clara understood that she was looking at 15 years of grief compressed into a single gaze. Boone was 15. Everett was 12. I put them on a mule. I took what I could carry. I brought them up this mountain, and I swore 2 things. First, that I would keep my brothers alive. Second, that I would make Edmund Whitfield pay for what he did to our father. He paused, drank his coffee, set the mug down with careful precision. I have spent 15 years gathering evidence. Ledgers, witness statements, geological surveys that prove the Crawford claim predates Edmund's filing by 18 months. Telegraph records that tie Edmund to the men who killed my father. I am a patient man, Clara. I can wait a very long time. Clara looked at the stack of documents on the table. 15 years of silent, methodical, implacable preparation. Not the work of a brute, the work of a strategist. But 6 months ago, Theron continued, and here his voice changed, dropping to something lower and harder. Something happened that changed everything. He looked at Everett. Everett reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was a telegraph transcript decoded from the numerical cipher in Everett's cramped, careful handwriting. I intercepted this from the telegraph office in Ridgewood, Everett said. It was sent from Denver to your father. It was in a code used by the Kessler Syndicate. Clara took the paper. She read it, and the blood drained from her face so completely that Everett reached out and steadied her elbow, afraid she might topple from her chair. The decoded message read, Whitfield, the railroad audit is closing in. Your debt stands at $40,000. We do not accept excuses from dead men. We are told you have an estranged daughter in Boston, educated, refined, young. She will bring a premium in San Francisco. Have her delivered to our Denver office by January, or we burn your town to the foundation stones. Sincerely, M. Kessler. Clara set the paper down on the table. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were dry. There is a kind of horror so vast that it bypasses tears entirely and goes straight to a cold, numb clarity. The clarity of a person who has just been shown the shape of the abyss they were standing on the edge of without knowing it. He was going to sell me, Clara said. Not a question, a statement. Yes, Theron said. My father, who I believed was dead, who abandoned my mother and left her to die in poverty. He was going to sell me to criminals. Yes. Clara looked at the tintype photograph of her mother, which still sat on the table where she had placed it the night before. Margaret's face, Margaret's eyes, the face of a woman who had endured 20 years of silence, loneliness, and grinding poverty to protect her daughter from a man who in the end had found a way to reach across that distance and turn Clara's life into currency. The Kessler Syndicate, Everett explained carefully, operates between Denver and San Francisco. They deal in stolen goods, rigged mining claims, political corruption, and human trafficking. The $40,000 your father owes them comes from years of gambling debts and embezzled funds. He stole from the Colorado Central Railroad expansion, laundered the money through Kessler-controlled gambling houses, and lost it all. When the debts became unpayable, the syndicate demanded an alternative form of collateral. Silence. The fire popped. Atlas whined. How did you find out about me? Clara asked, turning to Theron. Before the telegraph. How did you even know I existed? Theron reached into the oilskin package and withdrew one final document. It was not a legal filing or a financial record. It was a letter written on cheap paper in a hand that Clara recognized instantly because she had been reading that handwriting her entire life. It was her mother's. The letter was addressed not to Edmund Whitfield, but to Thomas Crawford. It was dated 1864. Clara's hands trembled as she held it. Her mother's voice seemed to rise from the faded ink, quiet and dignified, even in written form. Dear Thomas, I write to you because you were the only man in Ridgewood who showed me kindness when I had none. I am unwell. I fear I may not see my daughter Clara grow to womanhood. If something should happen to me, I beg of you as one good soul to another to watch over her. She is all I have. She is all that matters. Your friend, Margaret Whitfield. Clara could not speak. She held the letter against her chest and closed her eyes, and the tears she had been holding back since the night before finally came not in moths but in a slow, silent stream that tracked down her cheeks and fell onto the rough timber of the table. Our father received this letter in '64, Theron said quietly. 2 years later, he was dead. He never had the chance to honor your mother's request. I found the letter in his belongings when I was 18 the night I packed our things and brought my brothers up this mountain. I have carried it for 15 years. He let that settle. When Everett intercepted the Kessler telegraph 6 months ago and I saw your name, I knew. I knew exactly what Edmund was planning. And I knew that if I did not act, the daughter of the woman my father called a friend would disappear into a pit that no one climbs out of. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the scarred, massive man across the table, and she saw him, truly saw him for the first time. Not the ghost of Iron Peak, not the beast the townsfolk whispered about. A man who had been carrying a dead woman's letter for a decade and a half, waiting for the moment it would matter. The mail-order advertisement, Clara said, her voice raw. It was never about a wife. Theron shook his head. It was about getting you out of Boston before the syndicate did. The proxy marriage contract gives you legal status as a Crawford. That means if you disappear, it is not a nameless factory girl who vanishes. It is the wife of a landowner with a documented claim. Federal marshals get involved. Pinkerton agents get involved. The syndicate operates in shadows. They cannot afford that kind of light. "You married me to make me visible," Clara whispered. "I married you to make you impossible to erase." The weight of that sentence settled over the cabin like snowfall. Clara looked at Boone, who was still standing at the window, his back to the room. His shoulders were rigid, his arms still crossed, but his head was slightly bowed, and Clara realized with a start that the hostile, aggressive, impossible middle brother was fighting something behind that stone face that looked remarkably like emotion. "Theron didn't sleep for 3 days after we decoded that telegraph," Boone said without turning around. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual snarl. "I have known my brother for 30 years. I have seen him face down grizzlies, blizzards, and men with guns. I have never in my entire life seen him afraid." He paused. "He was afraid for you." Theron looked away. "Your mother was a good woman," Theron said to the fire. "Our father told us about her. She was kind to him when no one else in that town would look at him twice. A prospector with dirt under his nails and 3 motherless boys. She treated him like a human being. He kept her photograph. I found it after he died. The tintype, the connection, the golden thread that ran from a kind woman in Ridgewood in 1860 through 15 years of silence and patience and grief all the way to a cabin on a frozen ridge where her daughter now sat alive because a dead man's son had honored a promise his father never got to keep. Clara buried her face in her hands and wept. Not the quiet, controlled tears of before. She wept openly, her body shaking because the mountain of lies she had been living under had finally collapsed, and the rubble was bearing everything she had ever believed about who she was and where she came from. Theron did not embrace her. He clearly did not know how to comfort a weeping woman, but he reached across the table and laid one massive calloused hand on her forearm. Just that, the weight of it, the warmth. And Clara felt beneath the grief and the rage and the terror the first fragile stirring of something she had not felt since her mother died. Safety. It was Everett who broke the stillness with the words that turned grief into urgency. "There's more, Clara, and you need to hear it now because we are running out of time." He spread a second decoded telegraph on the table. This one was dated 3 weeks ago, just days before Clara's arrival in Ridgewood. "The syndicate is not patient. Your father's debt is overdue. They have dispatched a man to collect their collateral, meaning you personally. His name is Virgil Hask." The name fell into the room like a dropped blade. Boone's shoulders stiffened visibly at the window. Theron's hand on Clara's arm tightened by a fraction. Even Atlas raised his head from the floor and let out a low, uneasy rumble. "Who is Virgil Hask?" Clara asked. "The most dangerous man in the Colorado Territory," Boone said flatly, still facing the window. "Bounty hunter. Enforcer. He works the space between the law and the syndicate, and he has never once failed to deliver a target. He is not cruel for pleasure. He is not theatrical. He is simply efficient. He will come up this mountain with men and guns, and he will not leave without what he came for." "How long?" Clara asked. Everett folded his hands on the table. "The snow has kept the passes closed. That is the only reason we have had these 3 weeks of peace. But the weather will turn. A Chinook wind, a warm spell, a single week of melt, and those trails become navigable. When that happens, Hask will come, and we need to be ready." Clara looked at the 3 brothers, Theron massive and scarred and carrying 15 years of patient fury. Boone hostile and vigilant, a soldier without a war who had just found one. Everett gentle and sharp, the healer who knew that the next wounds he treated might be mortal. "Then teach me," Clara said. "Teach me everything." The transformation that followed was not the stuff of fairy tales. There was no montage, no magical moment where the frightened girl from Boston suddenly became a frontier warrior. It was slow, it was painful, it was earned in blood blisters, in the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that turns your muscles to water and your vision to blur. Theron taught Clara to shoot. They began with the Sharps rifle, a heavy single-shot weapon, with a kick that knocked Clara flat on her back the first 3 times she fired it. Theron stood behind her in the biting wind, patient as the mountain itself, his large hands guiding her smaller ones as she learned to seat the stock against her shoulder, to align the sights to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it, and to brace her entire body against the recoil that would otherwise send her spinning. He never raised his voice. He never showed frustration. When she missed, and she missed often in those first days, he said only one word: again. When she missed a second time, again. A third, again. It was an absolute immovable expectation that she would learn, because learning was the difference between living and dying, and Theron Crawford did not accept failure as an outcome. On the seventh day of practice, in a screaming January wind that turned her exposed skin numb in minutes, Clara put 3 consecutive shots into the center of a target at 60 yards. Theron said nothing, but he nodded once, a single downward motion of his chin, and Clara felt a surge of pride so fierce it warmed her more than any fire. Boone taught Clara to track. He was a brutal instructor, nothing like Theron. Boone did not explain. He demonstrated, once expected Clara to replicate it immediately, and expressed his displeasure with a silence more cutting than any insult. He dragged her through knee-deep snow at dawn, pointing at marks in the powder she could barely see. Deer, doe, moving northeast feeding. He would walk 20 more yards. Mountain lion, male, following the deer, 2 hours old. We go the other direction. He would walk on without looking back, leaving Clara to stumble after him or be left behind. But Boone, for all his harshness, was spectacularly good at what he did. Within 2 weeks, Clara could distinguish a rabbit track from a fox track, could read the depth and spread of a print, to estimate an animal's weight and speed, and could move through fresh powder without making a sound, a skill Boone told her flatly would save her life before the winter was over. The turning point between them came during a tracking lesson in late January. They had been out for 3 hours following a set of elk tracks along a frozen creek bed when the sky, which had been a deceptive bright blue, turned black with terrifying speed. A whiteout hit them with no warning, the wall of wind-driven snow so thick and so sudden that Clara lost all sense of direction within seconds. She could not see the trees. She could not see the ground. She could not see her own hands. She felt a massive arm wrap around her shoulders and pull her roughly against a rock face. Boone pressed his body against the windside, using his bulk as a shield. His duster spread wide to create a pocket of still air between Clara and the storm. He did not speak. He did not move. He held that position for 45 minutes until the squall passed. His face turned into the wind, his eyes closed against the driving ice. His arm locked around Clara's shoulders with the rigid, uncompromising strength of a man who had decided that this particular human being was not going to die on his watch. When the visibility returned and the wind dropped to a manageable howl, Boone released her and stepped back. He looked down at Clara's snow caked in his eyebrows and his beard stubble, his dark blonde hair plastered to his forehead. His expression was evaluating, measuring. Then he said the words that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. "You didn't panic, that's something." Coming from Boone Crawford, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Everett taught Clara frontier medicine. His lessons were quieter than his brother's, conducted at the kitchen table by lamplight, with his battered medical text spread between jars of dried herbs and rolls of clean linen. He showed her how to make a poultice from yarrow for wounds, how to brew willow bark tea for fever, how to sterilize a blade and a pair of forceps in boiling water and whiskey, how to stitch a wound closed with a curved needle and wax thread, practicing on a piece of deer hide until her stitches were even and tight. "I am not a real doctor," Everett told her one evening. "I am a man with books and guesswork and a desperate need to keep the people I love alive. There was a trapper 2 years back, a man named Josiah, who fell through river ice and tore his leg open on a submerged branch. I made a poultice. I set the wound. I thought I had done enough." He paused. "The infection took him in 4 days. I sat beside him and I watched him die. And I knew that if I had been faster, if I had known more, if I had cut the dead tissue away instead of packing it with herbs and hoping he would have lived." He looked at Clara with an honesty so raw it felt like a wound itself. "I became the healer because I failed the one time it mattered most. That is the truth of it. I do not want you to carry the same failure." These lessons, Clara would later understand, were not academic exercises. They were preparations for a specific event that the brothers could feel approaching, with the certainty of men who lived by the rhythms of the mountain. The snow would melt, the passes would open, and Virgil Hask would come. But in the weeks before that reckoning, something else was happening in the cabin on Iron Peak Ridge. Something quieter than gunfire and more dangerous than any blizzard. Clara was falling in love, not with the mountain, not with the frontier life, though she had grown to respect its brutal honesty. She was falling in love with the three men who inhabited this fortress, each in a different way, each for a different reason, and one above all others with a depth that frightened her more than anything Virgil Hask could bring up the trail. She loved Everett for his gentleness, for the way he read aloud from his medical texts in the evening, with the same reverence a preacher brought to Scripture, for the way he noticed when she was cold or tired, before she noticed it herself and quietly placed a blanket over her shoulders or refilled her coffee without being asked. She loved Boone for his ferocity, for the way he had shielded her body with his own in the whiteout without a second's hesitation for the gifts he began leaving. Without explanation or acknowledgement, a pair of fur-lined gloves on her chair one morning, a carved wooden comb on her washstand the next, each one crafted with a precision and care that contradicted everything about his rough exterior. He never mentioned them. She never thanked him. It was an understanding that existed entirely outside of language. But it was Theron who occupied the center of the storm inside her chest. Theron who lingered at the supper table after the meal was done, listening to Clara read aloud from the single volume of poetry she had brought from Boston. His expression never changed during these readings. The scarred, granite face remained as unreadable as ever. But he stayed. Night after night he stayed, when before Clara's arrival, he would have retreated to the loft the moment his plate was clean. It was the small things, the way his hand would brush against hers when he passed her a mug of coffee and linger there for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The way she caught him watching her once through the cabin window as she struggled to split a piece of kindling in the yard, and the expression on his face in that unguarded moment was so far removed from the terrifying ghost of Iron Peak that Clara felt her breath catch as though someone had pressed a hand against her chest. She could not name what she saw in his face that day. It would take her weeks more to find the word for it. The word was tenderness. And it was on the face of Theron Crawford, the most unexpected and devastating thing she had ever witnessed. One night in early February, Clara woke to a sound from the loft. Not the creak of floorboards or the rustle of blankets. A voice. Theron's voice, ragged and desperate, stripped of all its iron control. "Don't touch her. She's not part of this. Take me instead." Clara lay in the darkness, her heart pounding, her hands clenched in the furs. He was dreaming. A nightmare. And in that nightmare, Theron Crawford was not fighting for his own life. He was bargaining for hers. She heard Boone's low murmur waking his brother, the creak of the loft as Theron sat up, breathing hard. Then nothing. Clara stared at the ceiling. She pressed the gold locket against her throat, and she made a decision that would have astonished the girl who had boarded a westbound train in Boston 2 months ago. She did not want to leave this mountain, not because she had no choice, not because the passes were closed and the world below was dangerous. She did not want to leave because she had found in the most improbable place on earth, surrounded by three men, the world called beasts, something she had never in her life possessed. A family. The Chinook hit on the last Tuesday of February. A Chinook is a meteorological event unique to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. A sudden warm, dry wind that sweeps down from the peaks with almost supernatural speed, raising temperatures by 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Snow that has been locked in place for months begins to melt. Ice-choked trails turn to slush. Passes that have been impassable since November suddenly open like doors. The Crawford brothers knew what it meant the moment they felt the wind change direction. Theron came in from the trap lines at mid-morning, earlier than usual, his face set in the hard, focused expression Clara had learned to associate with danger. Boone was already checking ammunition stores in the workshop. Everett was sharpening his skinning knife with long, deliberate strokes, his jaw tight. "How long?" Clara asked from the stove where she was frying sourdough flapjacks. She did not need to specify what she was asking about. They all knew. 2 days, Theron said. "Maybe 3. Depends on how fast the lower trails clear." "Could be less," Boone said from the doorway. "Hask won't wait for perfect conditions. He'll push through slush if he has to." It happened before the second day was out. Clara was at the stove. Theron was out back repairing a broken snowshoe. Boone was in the barn. First he was at the table, inventorying the medical supplies he prayed he would not need. Atlas launched himself from his position by the hearth with a sound Clara had never heard from the animal before. Not a bark, not a growl, a deep guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the glass jars on the kitchen shelves. The massive dog bared his teeth, the coarse gray fur along his spine standing straight up, and hurled himself toward the front window with focused, predatory intent. Clara dropped the spatula and ran to the window. She pressed her face against the cold glass and felt her stomach drop, as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. 4 riders were coming up the trail. They were still a quarter-mile out, but the details were already visible in the flat gray light. Heavily armed, dark dusters and bowler hats that marked them instantly as city men, not prospectors or trappers. Professional, organized, riding in a loose diamond formation that covered all angles of approach. At the front rode a man whose face, even at this distance, radiated cruelty, the way a forge radiates heat. He was lean, angular, with a sharp jaw and deep-set eyes beneath the brim of a black hat. A silver-studded gun belt gleamed at his waist. He rode with the casual, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this many times before and had never once been given a reason to doubt the outcome. Virgil Hask. The cabin door burst open. Theron came through it like a force of nature, snow still on his shoulders, his eyes already locked on the riders through the window. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled the Winchester lever-action rifle from the wall rack, and tossed it to Boone, who had materialized from the barn with a soldered-off shotgun already in his hands. Boone caught the Winchester without looking, racked around, and moved to the woodpile in the yard, taking up a firing position behind the stacked timber with the ease of a man settling into a chair. Theron grabbed a second rifle, the heavy sharps that Clara had trained with. Everett pushed Clara toward the stone hearth, the most protected position in the cabin, with walls of granite and mortar that would stop any bullet short of a cannonball. He pressed the double-barreled shotgun into her hands, the same shotgun she had practiced with, the same shotgun whose weight she knew, whose kick she had felt, whose sights she had aligned 100 times against paper targets nailed to pine trees. "Remember what Theron taught you," Everett said. His gentle eyes had gone hard as flint. His voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness was a vibration Clara recognized because she felt it in her own chest. Fear. Real fear. If anyone gets past us, you do not hesitate. Do you understand me? You do not hesitate. Clara nodded. She could not speak. Her throat had closed, but her hands, she noticed with a distant, almost clinical detachment, were not shaking. They were wrapped around the shotgun with the firm, practiced grip Theron had drilled into her muscle memory over weeks of repetition, and they were absolutely still. Theron stepped out onto the porch. He planted his boots on the snow-dusted timber, raised the Sharps rifle to his shoulder, and stood there with his massive frame blocking the doorway entirely. Atlas positioned himself at Theron's left side, the enormous dog's lips peeled back from teeth that could crush bone, a continuous bone-rattling growl emanating from deep in his chest. Virgil Hask pulled his horse to a stop 50 yards from the porch. He was close enough now for Clara, peering from behind the hearth, to see the details of his face. It was worse up close. Not ugly, worse than ugly. It was the face of a man from whom all capacity for mercy had been surgically removed. His eyes were gray flat and devoid of warmth. "Crawford." Hask's voice carried easily over the wind, a smooth, oiled instrument that sounded like it had been used to deliver bad news many times and had come to enjoy the work. "The mayor of Ridgewood has sworn to the territorial governor that you kidnapped his daughter at gunpoint. We hold a legal bounty signed and sealed. I have 3 men here and 3 more at the trailhead. Hand over the girl and you 3 walk away breathing." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Her father. Edmund had not just sold her to the syndicate. He had constructed an elaborate cover story framing the Crawford brothers as kidnappers using the law itself as a weapon. If the brothers resisted, they were outlaws fighting legitimate bounty hunters. If they surrendered Clara, she would be delivered to the syndicate under the guise of a rescue operation, and no one would question it. It was a perfect trap. "She is my wife," Theron's voice boomed across the yard. "Married by proxy contract signed and witnessed by a justice of the peace in Ridgewood. Touch her, and I will bury you beside this porch." "Forced under duress, the mayor says." Hask replied, his thin lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. "Come now, Crawford. You're a mountain man with a rifle. I'm a professional with a legal warrant. We both know how this ends." "Yes," Theron said. "We do." He fired from the hip. The crack of the Sharp's rifle split the mountain air like thunder. One of the riders screamed and toppled from his saddle, his shoulder destroyed. Hask wheeled his horse with expert speed, drawing his revolver and firing twice as he spurred for cover behind the heavy woodpile on the opposite side of the yard from Boone. The third rider followed both men, dismounting and using the stacked timber as a barricade. Boone opened up from his position with the Winchester, the rapid crack, crack, crack of the lever action, driving Hask's men deeper into cover. Splinters of wood exploded into the air. One of Hask's men returned fire wildly, bullets slamming into the log walls of the cabin with heavy, meaty thuds that Clara felt through the soles of her boots. Theron ducked behind the thick door frame, working the single-shot Sharps with practiced speed reload, aim-fire the heavy rifle booming every 8 seconds, with a regularity that pinned Hask's position and prevented him from advancing. But the angles were wrong. There were too many of them and not enough cover on the porch. Hask was experienced, patient, and he was maneuvering his surviving men to flank the cabin from 2 directions simultaneously. Boone saw it developing and shifted his position, catching the flanking rider with a round that sent the man sprawling behind a snowbank. But the movement exposed Boone's left side, and a bullet from Hask's revolver creased his ribs with a searing slash that painted a line of red across his shirt. Boone grunted, staggered, but did not go down. He dropped behind the woodpile and kept firing. Everett inside the cabin was at the window with a hunting rifle, providing what cover he could, but his angle was limited and the thick log walls blocked most of his field of fire. Then it happened. Theron leaned from the doorframe to take a shot at Hask's position. In the same instant, the third rider, the one Boone had driven behind the snowbank, rose up and fired. The bullet hit Theron high in the left chest. The sound it made was unlike anything Clara had ever heard and would never forget. A heavy, wet impact. Theron staggered backward through the doorway, his massive frame slamming against the interior wall. The Sharp's rifle dropped from his hands and clattered on the floorboards. He slid down the wall to one knee, his left arm hanging useless, his right hand pressed against the spreading darkness below his collarbone. Blood shockingly red against the white of his linen shirt seeped between his fingers. "Theron!" Clara screamed from behind the hearth. "Stay back!" he choked, trying to rise, trying to reach the rifle with his one functioning arm. His face was the color of ash. Outside, Hask's voice triumphant. "He's hit! Move in!" Footsteps, fast, heavy, crunching through the slush toward the porch. Hask himself, sensing the kill, abandoning cover and striding toward the open doorway, with his revolver raised, his gray eyes locked on the wounded giant inside the cabin. Theron tried to stand, his knee buckled. He dropped back down, blood now dripping from his fingers onto the clean timber floor he had built with his own hands 15 years ago. Hask filled the doorway. His revolver was aimed squarely at Theron's head. His face held no anger, no excitement, no satisfaction. Just the flat professional calm of a man completing a transaction. "Shame," Hask said. "Killing a legend." He never pulled the trigger. Clara stepped out from behind the stone hearth. She moved around Theron's slumped body, placing herself between the wounded man and the killer in the doorway. She raised the double-barreled shotgun. She seated the stock against her shoulder exactly the way she had been taught. She aligned the sights. She looked Virgil Hask directly in his flat gray eyes, and she pulled both triggers. The blast was apocalyptic. The recoil threw Clara backward off her feet, slamming her onto the floorboards with a force that drove the air from her lungs and sent a bolt of white-hot pain through her right shoulder. The sound was so enormous, so total, that it seemed to erase all other sound from the world, leaving behind a ringing, cottony silence broken only by the thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. When the smoke cleared, Virgil Hask was no longer standing in the doorway. He was lying in the snow 6 feet from the porch, face up, motionless, the silver-studded gun belt catching the flat gray light. The third rider, the one behind the snowbank, saw his leader go down. He saw the girl standing in the smoke with the empty shotgun in her hands, and the look on her face, a look that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a kind of terrible, magnificent fury. He scrambled onto his horse and rode down the mountain trail as fast as the animal would carry him, leaving his wounded companion to fend for himself. The wounded rider, the one Theron had shot in the shoulder at the very beginning, was already dragging himself into the tree line, leaving a red trail in the melting snow. He wanted no further part of whatever was happening on that porch. Clara dropped the shotgun. It hit the floor with a clatter she could barely hear through the ringing in her ears. She turned and fell to her knees beside Theron. He was still conscious, barely his back against the wall, his right hand pressed over the wound that was pumping blood between his fingers in rhythmic, terrifying pulses. He looked at her, not at the doorway, not at the snow where Hask lay, at her. And the expression on his scarred, blood-drained face was not pain or shock or fear. It was astonishment. "Clara," he rasped, "you shot him." "I am a mountain man's wife, am I not?" she said, and her voice broke on the last word, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as she pressed her hands over his to slow the bleeding. "Now tell me how to fix this, Theron. Do not you dare die on me." Theron let out a sound that might under other circumstances have been a laugh, a single weak, breathless exhale. "Boil water, Clara, and fetch my knife." What followed was the longest night of Clara Whitfield's life, and it is the part of this story that separates the woman she was from the woman she became. The bullet was lodged beneath Theron's collarbone, buried in the thick muscle near his shoulder blade. It had shattered bone on the way in. If it stayed, Everett told Clara in a voice carefully stripped of panic, lead poisoning and sepsis would kill Theron within days. It had to come out. Everett guided the surgery. His hands were steady, his instructions precise, his knowledge stretched to its absolute limit and held there by sheer force of will. Boone, his own ribs, hastily stitched by Everett and wrapped in linen, refused to sit down. He took up position at the window with his shotgun across his knees, bleeding through his bandage, watching the tree line with the fixed, unblinking focus of a wounded animal guarding its den. Clara boiled water. She sterilized the hunting knife and a pair of iron forceps in the pot, adding a generous measure of the corn whiskey they used for trading. She took a long, burning swallow of the whiskey herself, coughing as it hit her empty stomach, and then poured it over the wound. Theron roared. "It done him." His back arched off the oak table. They had laid him on the cords in his neck, standing out like bridge cables, his right hand gripping the table edge so hard the wood groaned. Atlas howled from the corner, a sound of animal distress that pierced the cabin like a needle. Clara picked up the knife. She looked at Everett. He nodded. She made the incision. The next hour existed outside of normal time. It was a place of blood and firelight, and the smell of whiskey and copper, and the sound of a strong man trying not to scream. Theron drifted in and out of consciousness, his massive body racked with tremors, his voice, when it came, a delirious mumble that Clara could not always understand. But she understood enough. "Tried to keep my distance," he muttered, his eyes rolling, his face slick with sweat. "Too gentle for the ridge. Too bright. Syndicate would have destroyed her. Had to take her. Better she hates me. Better she lives." Clara's vision blurred. Tears fell onto her bloodied hands as she worked the forceps deeper, following Everett's whispered instructions, probing for the bullet that was trying to kill the man who had saved her life. "There," Everett breathed. "I can see it. Angle left. Gently." Clara felt the forceps contact something hard. Metal on metal. "Pull. Slowly. Do not twist." She pulled. The bullet resisted. Theron's body convulsed. Boone at the window turned his head for the first and only time during the procedure, his face white. The bullet came free with a sound Clara would hear in her dreams for years. She dropped the deformed lead slug onto the floorboards and pressed a wad of yarrow and clean linen into the wound with hands that had finally, after an hour of supernatural steadiness, begun to shake. For 3 days and 3 nights, Clara did not sleep. She bathed Theron's burning skin with snowmelt. She forced willow bark tea past his cracked, fevered lips. She changed the dressing every 4 hours, watching for the red streaks of infection that Everett had told her would be the harbinger of death. She kept the fire roaring because at this altitude, in this cold, letting the fire die meant letting the patient die. Boone slept in 2-hour intervals by the door, his shotgun across his knees, one eye on the trail and one ear on his brother's breathing. Everett monitored the wound, checked the pulse, adjusted the poultice, and murmured prayers in a way that did not look like praying to anyone who did not know him well enough to recognize it. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Clara was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head resting on Theron's uninjured arm, one hand still pressed against his bandaged chest, as though she could hold his life inside his body by force of will alone. She had been awake for 70 hours. She had eaten nothing but hard bread and jerky. Her golden hair was tangled, her face streaked with soot and dried tears, her hands stained with blood that soap and water had not entirely removed. Theron opened his eyes. The irises were clear. The fever sweat was gone. He looked at Clara's face inches from his own. Her cheek pressed against his forearm, her breathing deep and even, with the exhaustion of a woman who had fought death to a standstill and won. He moved his hand, slowly painfully against the protest of torn muscle and shattered bone. He laid his fingers against her hair and stroked it gently the way a man touches something he has spent his entire life believing he did not deserve. Clara stirred. Her eyes opened. She saw his face clear-eyed and alive, and for a long, suspended moment they looked at each other from a distance of inches, and everything that had passed between them was contained in that single gaze. Clara threw her arms around his neck. She buried her face in the crook of his uninjured shoulder and wept grey-eyed, shuddering sobs of relief and exhaustion, and something else, something larger and fiercer and more terrifying than anything she had felt before. Theron's right arm came up. It wrapped around her waist strong, despite the weakness, and pulled her against him. It was the first time he had held her, the first time anyone had held Clara since her mother died. And it was in that moment the only thing in the world that mattered. "You saved my life, Clara," he whispered into her hair. "You saved mine first," she replied fiercely, her voice muffled against his shoulder. From the doorway a sound. Clara lifted her head. Boone stood there, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face haggard from 3 days of standing guard on 2 hours of sleep and a cracked rib. But the hostility, the suspicion, the wall he had built between himself and Clara on the day she arrived, all of it was gone. What remained was something raw and real and hard-won. "Hask's surviving men will report back to your father," Boone said, his voice rough with fatigue. "The Kessler Syndicate won't stop. They can't afford to. You're worth too much to them." He paused, looked at Theron. Something passed between the brothers, a communication that existed in the space beyond words. "Tell her about Denver," Boone said. "Tell her about the judge." Theron looked at Clara. She saw it in his eyes, the final card, the weapon he had been holding in reserve for 15 years, waiting for the moment when every other option had been exhausted. "Get some rest, Clara," Theron said. "Both of you. Tomorrow we plan, because we are not hiding on this ridge anymore." Theron Crawford healed the way the mountain itself endured winter, slowly, stubbornly, and with a silence that made it impossible to tell whether the pain was lessening or merely being absorbed into some deeper place where it could not be reached. For 12 days after the fever broke, Clara refused to let him lift anything heavier than a tin coffee mug. He protested this exactly once. Clara looked at him with an expression she had learned from Boone, the flat, unyielding stare of a person who has made a decision and will not be moved by argument, reason, or the displeasure of a man twice her size, and Theron, the ghost of Iron Peak Ridge, the man who had faced down bounty hunters and blizzards and grizzlies without flinching, surrendered without another word. Boone found this enormously entertaining. It was, in fact, the first time Clara had ever seen him smile. Not the harsh, humorless grimace he deployed as a weapon, but a genuine smile that cracked the granite of his face and revealed for a fleeting second the boy he must have been before the world taught him to lock that boy away. He was sitting at the table cleaning his Winchester when it happened, and he caught Clara's eye and shook his head slowly, the smile still ghosting across his features. 15 years, Boone said. 15 years I have tried to tell that man what to do. You managed it in less than a fortnight. I had better leverage, Clara replied. I saved his life. All you've ever done is irritate him. Boone stared at her, then he laughed. It was a short, sharp, startled sound like a bark, the laughter of a man who has forgotten the mechanics of the thing and is rediscovering them in real time. Everett at the stove turned around with an expression of such exaggerated shock that Clara nearly laughed herself. Mark the date, Everett said solemnly. February 1882. Boone Crawford laughed. The Republic endures. But the laughter did not last. It could not last, because the warmth inside the cabin existed in direct opposition to the cold reality pressing against its walls, and that reality had a name and a timeline and a set of intentions that would not be deterred by locked doors or loaded guns. On the 13th day after the surgery, Theron called a council of war. He sat at the oak table with his left arm in a sling, fashioned from a strip of deer hide, his face still pale beneath the weathered tan, but his eyes clear and sharp, burning with the focused, calculated intensity of a man who has spent 15 years building a plan and is now preparing to execute it. Boone sat to his right, ribs taped his dark blonde hair pushed back from a face that had settled into its natural state of aggressive readiness. Everett sat to Theron's left, his medical satchel on the floor beside his chair, his auburn hair falling across his forehead as he leaned over a hand-drawn map of Ridgewood and the surrounding territory spread on the table between them. Clara sat across from Theron. She wore her practical frontier clothes, now canvas trousers, and a heavy flannel shirt that had belonged to Everett before he quietly left it folded on her bed one morning. Her golden hair was braided back tightly the way Boone had taught her to wear it in the field, so it would not catch on branches or obstruct her vision. Her mother's gold locket hung at her throat. The double-barreled shotgun leaned against the wall within arm's reach. She was not the same woman who had arrived on this mountain 2 months ago. That woman had been frightened, uncertain, operating on survival instinct and nothing more. The woman sitting at this table was something else entirely. She was afraid, but the fear had been integrated, absorbed, transformed from a paralyzing force into a sharpening one. She was afraid the way a blade is sharp, and she was ready to cut. Before I came to your father's town to place the mail order advertisement, Theron began, his deep voice carrying its usual weight of controlled authority, despite the weakness in his body. I rode to Denver. He reached into his saddlebags, which Everett had placed beside the table, and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with dark red wax bearing the impression of a federal eagle. He set it on the table with his care of a man handling the most valuable object he had ever possessed, because in a very real sense it was. I met with Judge Harlan Beckett of the Federal District Court. Beckett is 63 years old. He has served on the bench for 22 years. He is the only judge in the Colorado Territory who cannot be bought, bribed, or intimidated, and I know this because Edmund Whitfield has tried all three and failed. Theron opened the unfiling and spread its contents on the table. Geological survey maps, mining claim filings with dates and signatures, ledger pages covered in columns of figures, telegraph transcripts, and at the center of it all, a single document on heavy bond paper bearing the seal of the Federal District Court in the signature of Judge Harlan Beckett in dark blue ink. I brought Beckett everything. The original surveys proving our father's claim predates Edmund's filing by 18 months. The forged transfer documents with our father's signature on a paper he never agreed to sign. Ledger books from the Colorado Central Railroad showing the exact amounts Edmund embezzled and the exact accounts he funneled them through. Everett's decoded telegraph transcripts proving the Kessler Syndicate's involvement. He tapped the document with one thick finger. Judge Beckett signed a federal writ of attachment. Every asset Edmund Whitfield owns, the Ridgewood Bank, the timber mill, the mansion, the mining rights, all of it is frozen. Legally transferred to the Crawford name pending federal investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your father does not know this document exists. He believes his crimes are buried. He believes the only threat to his empire is a mountain man with a rifle. Theron looked at Clara, and for the first time in this conversation, something almost resembling satisfaction flickered across his scarred features. He is wrong. Clara stared at the writ. 15 years. 15 years of gathering evidence in silence, of watching and waiting, and building a case with the patience of a man laying stones for a cathedral he might never see completed. So we ride down to Ridgewood, Clara said. Present the writ, and it's over. No. It was Boone who spoke, and his voice had the flat, hard edge it always carried when the situation was about to become complicated. It is not that simple. Tell her, Theron. Theron's jaw tightened. He looked at Everett. Everett cleared his throat. I have been monitoring the trail with the spyglass every morning since the Chinook hit. 2 days ago, I counted them. 6 Pinkerton agents are camped at the base of Iron Peak Ridge, full detachment, armed with federal warrants. Clara felt the floor shift beneath her. Pinkerton. The detective agency. Your father hired them. He told the territorial governor that a wild mountain man kidnapped his daughter at gunpoint, robbed his safe, and dragged her into the wilderness. The governor issued a warrant. The Pinkertons are here to execute it. If any of us, he gestured at himself and his brothers, ride down that mountain, we will be arrested on sight, shackled, transported to Denver for trial, And while we sit in a cell, the syndicate collects you from your father's house with a signed receipt and no one asks a single question. The trap, Clara saw it now with perfect, terrible clarity. Edmund had constructed a double layer of protection. The syndicate provided the muscle. The Pinkertons provided the legal cover. If the Crawford brothers tried to use the writ, they would be arrested before they could present it. If they tried to fight, they were outlaws resisting federal agents. Either way, Clara ended up in her father's hands, and from her father's hands into the syndicates, and from the syndicate into a darkness from which there was no return. The writ is useless if the men carrying it are in chains, Clara said. Yes, Theron said, but the Pinkertons would not arrest me. Every head in the room turned to look at her. I am the supposed victim. I am the kidnapped woman. If I ride down that mountain alone freely, with no gun to my head and no Crawford at my side, the kidnapping story collapses. I am not a prisoner. I am a wife who chose to live on a mountain with her husband. And if I am carrying a federal writ signed by a judge with more authority than every Pinkerton agent in the territory combined, then I am not a damsel being rescued. I am an officer of the court. Boone opened his mouth to argue and then closed it again. He looked at Theron looked at Clara, and in the look that passed between them was a war, a silent, brutal 30-second war between the part of Theron that would burn the world to keep Clara safe, and the part that recognized with a clarity he could not deny that she was right. It's too dangerous, Theron said, but the words lacked conviction, and Clara, who had learned to read the silences between his sentences the way Boone read tracks in the snow, heard what he was not saying. It is the only way. I will not be alone, Clara said. She looked at Everett. You can get into Ridgewood without being seen. You know the trails the Pinkertons don't watch. You've been doing it for years when you go down to intercept telegraphs. Everett nodded slowly. There is a route through the eastern ravine, steep, dangerous in the melt, but passable for a man on foot who knows where to step. Mrs. Pruitt, Clara said. The name dropped into the quiet like a stone into deep water. Theron and Boone exchanged a glance. Who is Mrs. Pruitt? Boone asked. Eleanor Pruitt, Theron said. Edmund's housekeeper. She has worked in that mansion for 20 years. She was there when your mother came to Ridgewood, Clara. She was there when Edmund abandoned her. She knows everything. And she has kept silent for 20 years. Boone said, his voice hard with skepticism. Why would she talk now? Because she has a conscience, Clara said, and the certainty in her voice surprised even herself. Everett told me about her 2 weeks ago during one of our evening talks. He said there was a woman in Edmund's household who had tried 3 years ago to send a letter to the territorial governor. The letter was intercepted by Sheriff Tate before it reached the post office. Mrs. Pruitt was nearly dismissed. She stayed silent after that, not because she was loyal to Edmund, but because she was afraid. Clara looked at Theron. But she will not be afraid of me. I am Margaret's daughter, and Margaret was her friend. The plan crystallized over the next 2 hours, debated and refined, and tested against every contingency the brothers could imagine. Everett would descend the mountain on foot through the eastern ravine under cover of darkness, make contact with Mrs. Pruitt in Ridgewood, and secure from her the evidence that only someone inside Edmund's household could provide. The double-entry ledger books. The correspondence with the Kessler Syndicate that Edmund kept locked in the safe behind his study wall. The records that would corroborate the federal writ and transform it from a legal instrument into an irrefutable indictment. Mrs. Pruitt would then travel by wagon to the Pinkerton camp at the base of Iron Peak Ridge, arriving at dawn carrying the ledger books and prepared to testify as an independent witness. Clara would ride down the mountain alone, arriving at the Pinkerton camp at the same time. She would present herself as a free woman, not a captive. She would present the federal writ. And Mrs. Pruitt would stand beside her and confirm every word. The Pinkertons were professionals. They followed evidence, not money. When confronted with a federal writ corroborating documents from inside the mayor's own household and a supposed kidnapping victim who was clearly nothing of the sort, they would have no choice but to pivot. The kidnapping narrative would collapse. The arrest warrants for the Crawford brothers would be rendered void, and the path to Ridgewood would be open. And then, Claire asked. Theron met her eyes. And then you ride into Ridgewood, and you face your father, and you tear his empire down in front of the whole town. Clara held his gaze. Those eyes, scarred and wounded and still dangerous, looked back at her with something she had never seen in them before. Not command, Not expectation, trust. The absolute unreserved trust of a man placing the most important mission of his life into someone else's hands because he believed with every fiber of his being that those hands were strong enough to carry it. "I'll need a horse," Clara said. Theron almost smiled. "You'll have the best one I own." The night before Clara's descent was the longest of the winter. Everett left at midnight, slipping out the cabin door, with the silent, practiced ease of a man who had made this journey before. He carried no rifle, only a hunting knife and a leather satchel containing copies of the key documents, a letter of introduction written by Theron, and a sealed note addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt in Clara's own handwriting. He embraced Clara briefly at the door, his arms careful and gentle, and whispered, "I'll be in Ridgewood before dawn. Mrs. Pruitt will be at the Pinkerton camp by sunrise. You just have to get down the mountain." "I'll manage," Clara said. Everett smiled his quiet, warm smile. "I know you will." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness in the pines. Boone sat at the window, shotgun across his knees, watching the night. He did not speak to Clara. He did not need to. The carved wooden comb she found on her washstand that morning, the finest piece he had ever made, said everything Boone Crawford would never be able to put into words. And Theron stood at the door of the curtained sleeping area, his massive frame leaning against the timber partition, his left arm still in its sling, watching Clara as she packed her saddlebags by lamplight. "Clara," she looked up, "if something goes wrong in town, if the Pinkertons don't listen, if your father has more men than we know about." He paused. The scar on his cheek caught the lamplight. "You ride, do not stop. Do not look back. You ride north until you hit the Wyoming border, and you do not come back to this mountain. I am not going to run, Theron. Promise me." "No, wow." The word hung between them. Theron looked at her for a long time. Then he did something that Clara had never seen him do, and that Boone, watching from the window, had not seen him do in 15 years. He reached out with his good right hand and took Clara's hand in his. He did not squeeze. He did not pull. He simply held it. His massive calloused fingers closed around her smaller ones, and the warmth of his skin against hers was so startling, so fundamentally altering, that Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," Theron said quietly. "I knew it the day I read your letter. I knew it the moment you stepped off that train. And I know it now." Clara tightened her fingers around his. She looked up into the scarred, weathered, extraordinary face of the man who had reached across 1,000 miles of silence to pull her out of the dark. "I will come back," she said, "and I will bring you justice." Theron released her hand, stepped back. The iron control returned, locked down tight, but Clara had seen what was beneath it, and she would not forget. She rose before dawn. She dressed in heavy canvas trousers, a shearling coat lined with lamb's wool, and the wide-brimmed Stetson that Boone had given her without comment 3 weeks ago. She buckled the Colt Peacemaker to her hip. She pinned her mother's gold locket to the inside of her collar, where it rested against her skin, warm from her body heat. She braided her golden hair back tight. She was not the girl who had boarded a train in Boston. She was not the trembling bride who had climbed onto a wagon in Ridgewood. She was Clara Crawford, and she was going to war. Theron saddled the best horse in the barn, a powerful black quarter horse with a deep chest and intelligent eyes, and led it to the cabin door. He held the stirrup while Clara mounted, though the effort cost him visibly. His wounded arm braced against the horse's flank, his jaw clenched against the pain. Then he stepped back. Boone appeared from the side of the cabin. He held out a folded piece of cloth. Clara took it. It was a bandana, deep blue, the color of the sky on a clear winter day. "Tie it around your neck," Boone said gruffly. "Wind'll cut your throat raw on the switchbacks." He paused, looked at her with those hard, dark blonde eyes that had somewhere in the last 2 months lost their hostility and gained something infinitely more complex. "Give them hell, Boston." Clara tied the bandana around her neck. She looked at the 2 brothers standing in the snow before the cabin, framed against the massive log walls and the granite cliff behind them. Theron wounded, towering, his eyes burning with a ferocity that the bullet in his chest had not dimmed. Boone battered fierce, his arms crossed his jaw, said a warrior seeing his comrade off to battle. Atlas sitting between them, his enormous head tilted, his yellow eyes watchful. Clara touched the brim of her hat. Then she turned the horse and rode down the mountain. The descent took 4 hours. The trail was treacherous, half-melted, snow alternating with patches of exposed shale that sent the horses' hooves skating and skidding with every step. The switchbacks were narrow, the drop-offs severe, and the wind on the exposed faces cut through the shearling coat with surgical precision. Clara rode alone, the only sound the crunch of hooves, the creak of leather, and the vast indifferent silence of the mountain. She talked to herself as she rode. She talked to her mother. She rehearsed what she would say to the Pinkerton agents, testing the words in her mouth, discarding the ones that sounded weak, and keeping the ones that sounded like iron. She was afraid. The fear sat in her stomach like a cold stone, but she carried it as evidence of survival, not defeat. At the base of Iron Peak Ridge, the Pinkerton camp blocked the trail. 6 canvas tents arranged in a precise line beside the main track, a picket line of horses, and a campfire over which a coffee pot steamed. 6 men in dark suits and overcoats, armed with rifles and revolvers, stepped forward when they heard the horses' hooves on the gravel. The lead agent was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s, with sharp features, a neatly trimmed mustache, and the watchful measuring eyes of a professional who had spent 2 decades separating truth from lies. His name was Leland Cole, and he was, by reputation and by practice, a man who followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of who was paying his fee. "Halt," Cole said, raising one gloved hand. "State your name and your business." Clara dismounted. She was 5 feet and 3 inches tall. She weighed 115 pounds. She was standing in front of 6 armed federal agents, any one of whom could have restrained her with a single hand. She stood at her full height, shoulders back, chin lifted, and met Leland Cole's measuring gaze with one of her own. "My name is Clara Crawford, born Whitfield. I am the woman Mayor Edmund Whitfield of Ridgewood claims was kidnapped at gunpoint by the Crawford brothers." She paused. Let the words settle. "As you can see, I am alone. I am armed. I am riding freely. I was not kidnapped, Agent Cole. I was rescued." Cole's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You know my name." "I know a great many things I did not know 2 months ago, and I am here to share them with you, provided you are the kind of man who cares more about truth than about who is signing your checks." A flicker of something respect, perhaps, or at least professional interest crossed Cole's angular face. "Go on." Clara reached into her saddlebag and produced the wax-sealed envelope. She held it out. "This is a federal writ of attachment signed by Judge Harlan Beckett of the Federal District Court in Denver. It orders the immediate seizure and transfer of all assets belonging to Edmund Whitfield, pending investigation for fraud, embezzlement of federal railroad funds, and conspiracy." Cole took the envelope. He broke the seal with a thumbnail, unfolded the document, and read it. His eyes moved slowly across the text. His expression did not change, but Clara watched his posture shift, a subtle straightening of the spine that told her the document was having its intended effect. "This is a serious allegation," Cole said carefully. "It is a serious crime," Clara replied. Then from behind the line of tents, a wagon appeared on the Ridgewood Road. It was a plain buckboard driven by an older woman in a dark dress and heavy wool shawl. She brought the horse to a stop beside the Pinkerton camp and climbed down with the careful, determined movements of a 61-year-old woman who had made the most important decision of her life and was not about to lose her nerve now. Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt. Her face was lined, her hair gray beneath a simple bonnet, and her hands were shaking, but her eyes, dark brown and sharp, with decades of observing things she wished she had not seen, were clear and steady. "My name is Eleanor Pruitt," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of fear, but none of the weakness. "I have served as housekeeper in the Whitfield household for 20 years. I have come to testify of my own free will that Mayor Edmund Whitfield is a liar, a thief, and a man who attempted to sell his own daughter to the Kessler Syndicate to pay his gambling debts." She reached into the back of the buckboard and produced a leather case. She opened it and removed a set of leather-bound ledger books, the double-entry accounts Edmund kept in the safe behind his study wall. She had taken them the previous night after Everett Crawford's midnight visit, and she had walked out of the Whitfield mansion before dawn, carrying 20 years of secrets in a case not much larger than a Bible. "These are the mayor's private financial records," Mrs. Pruitt said, handing them to Cole. "They document every dollar embezzled from the Colorado Central Railroad, every payment to the Kessler Syndicate, and every attempt to cover his tracks." I can identify every entry. I can testify to what I witnessed in that house, and I am prepared to do so before any court in this territory. Leland Cole looked at the ledgers. He looked at the writ. He looked at Clara standing in the morning light with the mountain behind her, a Colt at her hip, and the truth in her hands. He looked at Mrs. Pruitt, trembling but resolute, holding out 20 years of silence like a debt she was finally ready to pay. Then he turned to his agents. "Saddle the horses," he said. "We're riding to Ridgewood, and someone get a message to the governor's office. This situation has changed." Clara mounted her horse. Mrs. Pruitt climbed back onto the buckboard. The Pinkerton agents formed up around them, a column of dark-suited riders with rifles across their saddle horns, and the procession began moving down the road toward Ridgewood. And then Clara heard something behind her, a sound that made her turn in the saddle and look up at the mountain she had just ascended. High on the ridge, silhouetted against the pale morning sky, three figures appeared on horseback. They were tiny at this distance, but Clara would have recognized them from 1,000 miles away. Three massive shapes on three dark horses riding in a tight formation down the switchback trail. Theron rode hunched forward in the saddle, his wounded arm braced against his body, Boone flanking him closely enough to catch him if he swayed. They moved with the unhurried, unstoppable momentum of men who had waited 15 years for this descent and would not be held back by bullets, blizzards, or broken bones. The Crawford brothers were coming down from the mountain. One of the Pinkerton agents saw them too. He raised a hand to shade his eyes. "That'll be the Crawfords," he said, something between wariness and awe in his voice. "That will be my husband," Clara said, "and my brothers." She turned her horse toward Ridgewood and did not look back again. The town of Ridgewood had not changed in 2 months, but Clara had, and the difference was so vast that the familiar mud street and frame buildings might as well have belonged to a different country. She rode through the main street flanked by Pinkerton agents, and the townsfolk stopped in their tracks. Women dropped their market baskets. Men stepped off the wooden boardwalks, their mouths open. They had expected many things. They had expected the Crawfords to return in chains. They had expected Clara Whitfield to be found dead in a snowdrift come spring. They had not expected this. A young woman in frontier clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, riding tall and straight on a black quarter horse, a Colt peacemaker on her hip, and the United States federal government at her back. Inside the Whitfield mansion, the scene that Clara walked into was exactly as the Crawford brothers had predicted. Edmund Whitfield was pacing the grand foyer, sweating through his tailored suit. Despite the cold, his silver hair disheveled, his politician's composure fraying at every seam. A Kessler Syndicate enforcer, a heavy-set man with dead eyes and a shoulder holster visible beneath his coat, lounged on the velvet sofa with his muddy boots on the imported rug. Sheriff Tate stood by the front door, his hand resting on his revolver, his face the color of old cheese. "Hask is a week overdue," the enforcer was saying, examining his fingernails with theatrical boredom. "Hask went up that mountain with 4 men and none of them came back. Kessler is sending 20 men from Denver next week. You're paying for it, Edmund. Every last dollar." "The Pinkertons will handle it," Edmund squeaked. His voice had lost all its political resonance. It was the voice of a man who could feel the ground crumbling beneath his feet. The heavy oak doors of the Whitfield mansion did not open. They exploded inward, the iron lock shattering off the wood with a crack that echoed through the marble foyer like a rifle shot. Leland Cole strode through the entrance first, his Pinkerton badge visible on his lapel, 2 agents flanking him with their hands on their weapons. Clara stepped in behind them. She walked across the marble floor with the steady, measured stride of a woman who had crossed a mountain, survived a siege, cut a bullet from a man's chest, and ridden down a frozen ridge, lone in the dark. Her boots rang on the stone. The Colt sat heavy on her hip. Her golden hair was braided back, tight, her cheeks reddened by the cold. Her blue eyes carrying a light that Edmund Whitfield, when he turned and saw her, recognized instantly, and with a terror that went far deeper than any fear of the law. It was Margaret's light, Margaret's eyes, the eyes of the woman he had abandoned 20 years ago, staring at him from the face of the daughter he had sold. "You," Edmund whispered. He stumbled backward, nearly falling over a chair. "You're alive." "No thanks to you, Father," Clara said, and the word father fell from her lips like a stone dropped from a great height. Behind Clara, the Crawford brothers entered the foyer. Theron first, his arm in a sling, his massive frame filling the doorway. his eyes fixed on Edmund with 15 years of patient, implacable fury. Atlas flanked his left side, the enormous wolfhound's lips curled back from teeth that gleamed in the chandelier light, a continuous low growl emanating from his chest. Boone came next, his ribs still taped as Winchester, held casually in one hand, his dark blonde hair pushed back from a face that promised violence with the certainty of a weather forecast. Everett entered last, carrying the leather case of legal documents, his gentle face set in an expression of controlled, deliberate calm. The syndicate enforcer leapt from the sofa, his hand diving for his shoulder holster. Theron's Winchester was up and leveled before the man's fingers touched the grip. The movement was so fast, so smooth, so utterly without wasted motion that it seemed impossible for a man with a shattered collarbone and less than 2 weeks of recovery. "Touch it," Theron rumbled, "and they will bury what's left of you in a matchbox." The enforcer froze. He looked at the Winchester. He looked at Theron's face. He saw in those eyes the absolute and unambiguous promise of death, delivered without anger, without hesitation, and without the slightest possibility of bluff. His hand moved slowly, carefully away from the holster and back to his side. The Pinkerton agents fanned out across the foyer, their movements precise and professional. Leland Cole stepped forward and addressed the room with the calm authority of a man who had done this more times than he could count. "Mayor Edmund Whitfield, I am Leland Cole, senior agent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I have been presented with a federal writ of attachment signed by Judge Harlan Beckett of the Federal District Court, supported by documentary evidence and corroborated by independent witness testimony. You are under arrest for grand larceny, fraud, embezzlement of federal railroad funds and conspiracy." Edmund's face went through a series of transformations so rapid they looked almost comic. Shock, denial, rage, and finally the most dangerous expression of all, desperation. "Lies," Edmund spat. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "She's been tortured, brainwashed. That man," he jabbed his finger at Theron, "kidnapped my daughter at gunpoint and has held her prisoner on that mountain for 2 months. She is suffering from a break in her mind. Nothing she says can be trusted." Clara did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She stepped to the center of the foyer, into the space between her father and the Pinkerton agents, and she spoke with a clarity so cold and so precise that it silenced the room. "I was not kidnapped. I was sold." She let the word hang. "My father, Mayor Edmund Whitfield, embezzled over $40,000 from the Colorado Central Railroad expansion to fund his gambling debts. When those debts became unpayable, he offered the Kessler Syndicate an alternative form of collateral. Me, his own daughter, a daughter he abandoned before she was born, a daughter whose mother he left to die in poverty. He provided the syndicate with my name, my location, and my physical description, and he arranged for me to be collected and transported to their operations in San Francisco." She reached to her collar and unclipped the gold locket, her mother's locket, the only thing Edmund Whitfield had ever given Margaret Whitfield in 20 years of silence. She held it up, the gold catching the chandelier light, and then she dropped it onto the marble floor. It landed with a sharp ringing sound that echoed through the foyer like the final note of a hymn. Theron Crawford's proxy marriage gave me legal protection. It created a federal paper trail. If I disappeared, it would not be a nameless factory girl who vanished. It would be a documented wife of a landowner. Federal marshals would investigate. The syndicate cannot operate under that kind of scrutiny. The Crawford brothers did not kidnap me. They saved my life. Mrs. Pruitt stepped forward from behind the Pinkerton agents. Edmund saw her, and the last remnants of color drained from his face. "Eleanor," he breathed. "What have you done?" "What I should have done 20 years ago," Mrs. Pruitt said. Her voice shook, but her chin was high, and her dark brown eyes were unwavering. "I watched you abandon that girl's mother. I watched you steal from this town. I watched you plot to sell your own child. I kept your secrets because I was afraid of you. I am not afraid anymore." She held up the leather-bound ledger books. "These are your private accounts, Edmund. Every dollar you stole, every payment to the Kessler Syndicate, every lie written in your own hand." Leland Cole took the ledgers. He opened them, scanned the entries, and compared them to the documents in Everett's case. His expression tightened. He looked at Edmund, then at the enforcer on the sofa, then at Sheriff Tate by the door. These corroborate the writ completely, Cole said. He nodded to his agents. Take him. Two Pinkerton agents seized Edmund's arms and pinned them behind his back. Edmund struggled, his voice rising to a shrill, panicked register that bore no resemblance to the booming political baritone the town had listened to for 12 years. You can't do this. I am the mayor. I built this town. I built this town. And you sold its soul, Clara said. She stepped forward until she was close enough to see the broken veins in her father's cheeks, the sweat on his forehead, the hollow, terrified desperation in his eyes. She felt no pity. She felt no filial love. The frail, obedient daughter Edmund had tried to create by proxy the meek, marketable commodity he had offered to criminals was dead. She had been buried in the snows of Iron Peak Ridge, and what had risen in her place was something Edmund Whitfield could never have anticipated and would never understand. Take him away, Clara said. I never want to see his face again. Edmund sagged in the agent's grip, and then he stopped. Not struggling, not pleading. He simply stopped the way a man stops when something inside him, some last internal support beam, finally gives way. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the floor. Margaret, he said. His voice was barely audible. Broken, not the voice of a politician or a criminal or a desperate man bargaining for his freedom. The voice of something older and more wretched than any of those things. Your mother, I wrote her a letter once, when you were 5 years old. I sat at this desk. He nodded toward the study, and I wrote 3 pages. I told her I was sorry. I told her I wanted to see you. I told her I would send money. He paused, a muscle in his jaw spasmed. I tore it up before I sealed the envelope. I was too much of a coward to send it, too afraid it would lead back to me, too afraid of what it would cost. He closed his eyes. That is the truth. Not that I didn't feel it, that I felt it, and I was too weak to act on it. The foyer was silent. Clara looked at her father's bowed head, his gray hair falling across his forehead, his shoulders sunken beneath the expensive suit. She understood with a clarity that was neither merciful nor merciless, but simply accurate, that this was not a plea for forgiveness. It was not a redemption. It was a confession of the most ordinary and the most devastating kind of evil, the evil of a man who knew the right thing to do and chose again and again to do nothing, not because he lacked a conscience, because he lacked the courage to follow it. Clara said nothing. She watched the Pinkerton agents lead her father out through the shattered doors down the front steps and into the muddy street of Ridgewood, where the townsfolk had gathered in a silent staring mass. The syndicate enforcer who had been watching the proceedings with the calculating stillness of a predator evaluating a rapidly deteriorating situation made his move. He did not reach for his weapon. He stood up slowly, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the back entrance of the mansion with the unhurried gait of a man who has decided that discretion is the better part of continued breathing. The money was frozen, the legal walls were closing, and Virgil Haas, the syndicate's best enforcer, was dead on a mountain porch brought down by a girl with a shotgun. There was nothing left to collect and no profit in dying for it. He slipped out the back door and vanished into the alleys of Ridgewood, carrying the bad news back to Denver. The Kessler syndicate would not come to Ridgewood again. Sheriff Tate attempted to follow the enforcer's example. He edged toward the side door with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent his career avoiding confrontation. Boone stepped into his path. The middle Crawford brother stood with his arms crossed, his Winchester slung over one shoulder, his dark blonde eyebrows raised in an expression of exaggerated curiosity. Going somewhere, Sheriff. Tate looked at Boone. Boone looked at Tate. The calculation was brief and overwhelmingly one-sided. Tate sat down in the nearest chair and put his hands on his knees. Didn't think so, Boone said. In the days that followed, the truth spread through Ridgewood with the speed and force of a river breaking through a dam. The mayor was a fraud. The mountain men were the rightful owners of the silver claim. The delicate mail-order bride from Boston was the most dangerous woman in the territory. 20 years of carefully constructed lies came apart in a matter of hours, and the town that had whispered about the ghost of Iron Peak behind closed doors now stood in the open and stared at the reality they had been too afraid or too comfortable to see. The town council, terrified of economic collapse, approached Theron. The writ of attachment gave the Crawford brothers legal ownership of the bank, the timber mill, the mansion, and the mining rights. They were on paper the most powerful family in Ridgewood. Theron sat in the mayor's study, a room that smelled of Edmund's cigars and Edmund's lies, and he listened to the counsel's pleas with the patience of a man who had spent 15 years waiting for this moment and was discovering that it tasted nothing like he had expected. He did not want power. He did not want Ridgewood. He wanted justice, and justice had been served. He negotiated a settlement that took less than an hour, the mining rights restored to the Crawford name, the embezzled funds returned to the railroad, and the town bank placed under the management of an administrator appointed by Judge Beckett. Then Theron Crawford stood up from Edmund Whitfield's desk, put on his hat, and walked out of the mansion without looking back. But the story was not quite finished. There was one more revelation waiting, quieter than the gunfire and the courtroom drama, but no less powerful. In the leather case Mrs. Pruitt had brought from the mansion buried beneath the ledger books and the financial records, Everett found a small wooden box. It was old, the hinges rusted, the wood warped by years of sitting in the back of Edmund's safe. He opened it at the oak table in the Crawford cabin 2 days after the arrest, while Clara sat beside him and Theron stood by the fire, and Boone leaned against the doorframe. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them. Letters from Margaret Whitfield to Edmund Whitfield, sent over the course of 20 years, begging for acknowledgement, begging for support, begging for anything at all. A single word, a single dollar, proof that the man who had fathered her child remembered she existed. Edmund had kept everyone. He had never responded to any of them. But beneath the letters at the very bottom of the box was a different document. Not a letter to Edmund, a letter to Thomas Crawford. And it was in Margaret's hand. Clara recognized the paper. She recognized the ink. She recognized the handwriting, the same handwriting that had taught her to form her own letters as a child, that had written shopping lists and poetry exercises, and in the final weeks the shaking, barely legible notes Margaret had left on the nightstand when she was too weak to speak. The letter was dated 1864. It was the second copy of Margaret's plea to Thomas Crawford, the same plea Theron had already shown Clara, the one Margaret had sent to Thomas through a mutual acquaintance. But this copy had been sent to Edmund's address in Ridgewood, apparently in a separate envelope, perhaps hoping it might reach Thomas through the town's small post office. It had never reached Thomas. Edmund had intercepted it, he had read it, he had kept it, and the implications of that fact were staggering. Edmund had known since 1864 that Margaret had a protector in Thomas Crawford. He had known that Thomas was aware of Clara's existence, and 2 years later, Thomas Crawford was dead murdered in a claim dispute that had never been adequately explained. Theron held the letter in his hands. His scarred face was perfectly still. But Clara, who had learned to read the geography of that face the way Boone read tracks in the snow, saw the tremor in his jaw, saw the way his fingers tightened on the paper, saw 15 years of grief and fury compressed into a single point. "He killed our father," Theron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for the mine. He killed him because our father knew about you. Because our father was the only person in Ridgewood who could connect Edmund to Margaret and through Margaret to you. Our father died protecting a secret that was not even his to keep." Clara reached across the table and took Theron's hand. She held it. She did not speak. There were no words for this. There was only the warmth of skin against skin and the knowledge shared in silence that the circle was closed. Thomas Crawford had received Margaret's letter. He had intended to honor it. He had been murdered before he could. His eldest son had found the letter in his belongings and carried it for 15 years waiting. And when the moment came, Theron had honored the promise his father never got to keep. A good woman's plea, a good man's intention. 15 years of silence. And then at last an answer. Clara looked around the foyer of the Whitfield mansion one last time. The velvet curtains, the imported rugs, the chandelier, the marble floor where she had dropped her mother's locket. She picked up the locket now. She did not put it back on. She held it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. Then she looked at Theron. The three Crawford brothers stood together in the foyer, scrubbed and patched and bandaged, but still unmistakably what they were. Mountain men, frontier men, men who had been carved by the wind and the cold and the silence of Iron Peak Ridge into something the velvet-lined parlors of Ridgewood could not contain. Theron faced Clara. His left arm was still in its sling. The scar on his cheek was white in the afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows. He held her gaze with the steady, unwavering intensity she had come to know, as well as her own heartbeat. "It's over, Clara," he said softly. His voice, always deep, always rough, carried a note she had never heard in it before. Tenderness. Exposed, unguarded, completely vulnerable tenderness offered without condition and without defense. The house is yours if you want it. The bank assets will provide for you. You can have a real life, a comfortable life, in town with people with everything you never had in Boston. You don't have to go back up the mountain. You're free. The word hung in the air between them. Free. The thing Clara had never been. Not in Boston where poverty was a cage. Not on the train where desperation was a chain. Not even on the mountain where the threat of Hask and the syndicate had been a wall of ice surrounding every moment. But she was free now. Truly free. For the first time in her 20 years of life, Clara Whitfield Crawford had a choice that was entirely and completely her own. She looked around the mansion. She smelled the furniture polish and the faded cigar smoke and the particular scent of wealth built on deceit. It smelled like a tomb. She looked at Boone. He was standing by the door with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall with the rigid, determined focus of a man who was absolutely not going to show emotion and was failing at it so completely that the effort itself was more revealing than any tears could have been. She looked at Everett. The youngest brother stood beside the fireplace, his auburn hair falling across his forehead, his eyes bright and wet, his medical satchel hanging from one shoulder. He was not trying to hide anything. He was smiling at her, a trembling, hopeful, heartbreaking smile, the smile of a man who has found a family he did not know he was missing and is bracing himself to lose it. She looked at Atlas, who was sitting at Theron's feet with his enormous head tilted to one side, his tail thumping the marble floor in a slow, steady rhythm, watching Clara with the simple, uncomplicated adoration of a creature that has decided once and for all where it belongs. And she looked at Theron, the scarred, towering, silent man who had bled for her, who had planned for her, who had given her a soft year's space to find her own strength without ever asking for gratitude or acknowledgement or anything at all in return. The man who had nightmares about protecting her, the man who could not bring himself to hold her hand until the night before she rode into battle because he was so afraid of wanting something he believed he did not deserve, that he had built a fortress of silence around the wanting and called it duty. Clara walked across the marble floor. Her boots rang with each step. She stopped in front of Theron. She reached up slowly and traced the silver scar on his cheek with her fingertip. The scar he had earned pulling two men out of a collapsed mine shaft while the authorities stood by and did nothing. The scar that had terrified her on the platform in Ridgewood and that she now knew as well as the lines on her own palm. "My old life was a cage, Theron," she whispered. She rose onto her tiptoes. She pressed her lips to his. It was a brief, fierce, gentle kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the sharp, clean air of Iron Peak Ridge. When she pulled back, her blue eyes were shining, and her face held a smile so radiant and so wild that it transformed her from a beautiful woman into something closer to a force of nature. She looked at all three brothers, Theron, Boone, and Everett, the men the world called beasts, the men who had given her everything and asked for nothing. "Take me home," Clara said. "The fire is going out and we have traps to check." Boone made a sound. It was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. Something that cracked his granite face wide open and revealed the human being he had spent 30 years trying to bury. Everett wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and did not bother to pretend it was dust. Atlas barked once, a deep, joyful boom that echoed off the marble walls. And Theron Crawford, the ghost of Iron Peak Ridge, the most feared man in the Colorado Territory, looked down at the small, golden-haired woman standing in front of him and smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not a practiced smile. It was a smile that broke through the scar tissue and the silence and the years of grief like a crack in a frozen river, letting something warm and unstoppable pour through. His hand found Clara's. His calloused fingers closed around her smaller ones, and he held on. They walked out of the mansion together, all four of them, plus Atlas, into the sharp, bright mountain sunlight of a Colorado afternoon. They mounted their horses, Clara on her black quarter horse, Theron on his bay, Boone and Everett on their matching roans. The town of Ridgewood watched them from the boardwalks and the storefronts, in the muddy streets, silent, reverent, and for the first time in 20 years, seeing clearly. They rode out of town and up the trail toward Iron Peak Ridge. The mountain rose above them, granite and pine and snow, ancient and indifferent and magnificent. The trail was muddy and treacherous and long. The wind cut cold across the switchbacks. Clara did not look back. 1 year later, autumn 1882, the aspens on the lower slopes of Iron Peak Ridge had turned to gold, a billion leaves trembling in the clean mountain air like coins scattered by a giant's hand. The sky was the deep, impossible blue that only exists above 10,000 feet, the blue that makes you understand why the people who live in these mountains never leave them. The Crawford homestead had grown. The main cabin now had a proper second room, added over the summer by 3 pairs of hands and one smaller pair that insisted on helping despite being told repeatedly that pregnant women should not be lifting roof beams. A garden grew in the sheltered south-facing clearing beside the cabin, improbable at this altitude, but thriving through a combination of good soil, careful irrigation, and the sheer unyielding stubbornness of the woman who had planted it. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. Horses grazed in the meadow below. A line of washing hung between 2 pines flapping in the breeze. Clara sat on the porch in the golden afternoon light. A book lay open in her lap, but she was not reading it. She was watching the valley below where the aspens burned like a river of fire, and beyond them the faint smudge of Ridgewood in the distance, a town that had been reborn in the years since Edmund Whitfield's arrest, smaller now but cleaner, governed by honest men, and watched over by a federal administrator who answered to Judge Beckett and to no one else. Her golden hair was loose, catching the sunlight. Her face had changed in a year. The pallor of Boston was gone, replaced by a healthy, sun-touched warmth. Her hands, once soft and blistered, were strong and capable now, calloused in the right places, gentle in the others. She wore practical frontier clothes, a cotton shirt and canvas trousers and leather boots that had walked more miles of mountain trail than she could count. Her mother's gold locket hung at her throat. It was not empty anymore. She had placed inside it a tiny, perfect wildflower pressed flat, picked from the meadow on the first day of spring. A new beginning in a vessel that had carried only loss. Theron came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The scar on his face caught the golden light. He was still enormous, still intimidating. But when he saw Clara on the porch, the hardness in his expression melted into something warm and profoundly, quietly joyful. He sat down beside her on the porch step. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and he rested his chin on the crown of her golden hair. They sat like that for a while, watching the light change on the mountains, saying nothing because the silence between them had long since ceased to be empty and had become instead the most comfortable room they had ever shared. Boone and Everett rode in from the lower pasture, dusty and laughing about something, a rare and wonderful sound that Clara had heard with increasing frequency over the past year, and that still every time made her chest ache with gratitude. Boone tipped his hat to Clara with exaggerated theatrical courtesy, a running joke between them that had begun the day she threw a pine cone at his head for calling her Boston, and had never quite ended. Everett dismounted with a bundle of herbs tucked under one arm, already planning his next remedy, already thinking about the medical text he wanted to order from Denver, already being in every way that mattered the gentle, brilliant, irreplaceable heart of the Crawford family. Atlas bounded between them all, tail wagging with the frantic, boundless joy of an animal that has found its pack and cannot believe its luck. Clara placed her hand on her belly. She looked at Theron. She smiled, and in the smile was a secret and a promise, in the beginning of something new. Theron looked down. His eyes went wide. And then the ghost of Iron Peak Ridge smiled for the second time in a year, a smile so genuine and so unguarded that it cracked the scar on his cheek into a new shape, a shape that looked for the first time like it belonged on a happy man's face. He pulled Clara closer, and she closed her eyes against the warmth of him, and the autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and pine, and the first distant hint of winter down from the high peaks. The legend of the ghost of Iron Peak Ridge changed forever after that winter of 1881. Theron Crawford never returned to live in the valley. He and his brothers expanded their mountain claim into the largest, most prosperous high-altitude ranch in the Colorado Territory, running cattle in the summer meadows, entrapping the high country in winter, building something permanent from a place the world had called uninhabitable. And the town of Ridgewood learned to respect the mountain. They learned to respect the men who had carved a life from its granite bones. And they learned, above all, to respect the woman who had chosen it. Clara Crawford was no longer a mail-order bride traded in the shadows. She was no longer a factory girl from Boston with 11 cents and an eviction notice. She was a daughter of the West, a woman whose heart had been forged in the bitter cold, saved by three brothers the world called beasts, and fiercely, irrevocably devoted to the magnificent, untamed life they built together above the clouds.